Not formally, Bria said dryly, but I wound up standing beside her during some of the play after she'd been eliminated. That was one cranky reptiloid, let me tell you. Han chuckled, then explained about how he and Shalmar had had a run-in back on Deverin 5 years ago. She told me she was going to bite my head off, Han said. And she'd have done it, too, if it hadn't been for Chewie. Deverin? Oh, yes, I remember, Bria said, and then, at Han's look, fell silent again. She bit her lip before the intensity of his gaze. So it was you that day at the Elysian revival, Han said. I thought I was seeing things. I swore off drinking 4 months after that day. Bria nodded. Yes, that was me, Han. But I couldn't let you blow my cover. I was in that crowd for a mission. What was that mission? She met his eyes steadily. To assassinate Veritil, the Tilanda Til. You followed it up, though. Far as I know, Veritil is still alive. Though probably not for long. Han regarded her for a long moment. You really have done just about anything for the Resistance, haven't you? Bria was distressed by his stare. Don't look at me like that, Han! She cried. They're evil. They deserve to be killed. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess they do, he said. But it's kinda unnerving, you know? She gave him a shaky smile. Sometimes I unnerve myself. When they reached Ord Mantell, Bria met with the Resistance leaders there to explain the mission and its importance. She was elated that, after their meeting, the Resistance promised to dispatch 3 ships and 100 troops, plus appropriate support and medical personnel, immediately. As Han and Bria were preparing to board the Falcon for the trip back to the Rebel Deep Space Rendezvous, one of the junior officers came up to her with a message flimsy. She scanned it, then looked up at Han. She gave him a tight smile. HQ just got a message from Togoria. There's a small contingent of Togorians who have volunteered to come along. They want us to pick them up on our way back. Han smiled slowly. Muerg and Rav? He guessed. It doesn't say. But it's a good bet they're part of the group, Bria said. Can we? Sure, he said, not meeting her eyes. Togoria's a pretty world. I wouldn't mind seeing it again. Bria looked away, too. It was on a Togorian beach that she and Han had first become close. It was a beautiful world, fraught with memories for both of them. They didn't talk much during the trip. Bria found herself so nervous that her stomach was in knots. She wondered how Han felt. Han eased the Falcon down onto the landing field bordering Karas, the largest city on Togoria. After completing his post-flight checks and updating his log, he and Bria headed for the landing ramp. A group of Togorians were already heading out to the field, and Han thought he recognized one huge black male with white chest hair and whiskers. And there was a smaller, orange and white female with him. Bria smiled excitedly. Muerg and Rav! The humans jogged down the ramp, and reached the ground just in time to be seized and hugged so violently their feet left the ground. Muerg! Han shouted, so glad to see his old friend that he wound up thumping the huge felonite on the chest with his fists, while his feet dangled. How are ya, buddy? Han. Muerg was nearly choked with emotion. Togorians were an emotional people, especially the males. Han Solo. Muerg very happy see Han Solo again. Too long it has been. He obviously hasn't been practicing his basic, Han thought, amused. Muerga's basic had always been rather fractured, but after all this time, it was worse than ever. Hey, Muerg! Mrav. It's great to see you both. After their greetings were over, Mrav explained that there was a contingent of Togorians who'd had run-ins with Elijah over the years who wanted to be part of the assault. 6 of our people were either enslaved or close to those enslaved there, Han, Mrav said. We wish to have a part in making sure that no other Togorians will ever again be trapped by that terrible place. Han nodded. Well, we can get started any time you wish, he said. Murg shook his head. Not possible until tomorrow, Han. Sarah's Mosgoth was attacked mid-flight by Big Lip Han. Broke its wing. Sarah has borrowed Mosgoth, sent us message, will be here tomorrow. Tonight Han and Bria are honored guests, yes? Han looked at Bria and shrugged. Sure, he said. She didn't meet his eyes. Fine. They spent the afternoon catching up with their friends on 10 years of history. Murg and Rav seemed a very happy couple, even though, in true Togorian tradition, they spent only a month out of each year together. They had 2 cubs, both female, and Han and Bria met them. One was barely more than a kit, and she was extraordinarily cute. Bria and Han spent a couple of hours playing with them in the beautiful gardens. That evening, the humans were wined and dined with the best of Togorian food and drink. Togorian storytellers regaled them with tales of their own escapades from 10 years ago, when they'd escaped from Elijah. Han barely recognized himself. The accounts had obviously been enhanced over the years, until he emerged as such a heroic figure it was almost laughable. Han was careful with the strong Togorian liquor, and noticed that Bria drank only water. I can't drink, she said when asked. I'm scared I'll get to like it too much. I have to be careful. Once addicted, you can get addicted again, to other things. Han admired her restraint, and said so. After the festivities were over, Murg and Rav conducted their guests to the finest of their guest apartments, then bade them good night. Han and Bria stood on opposite sides of the living room and regarded each other in silence for a long, uncomfortable moment. Han glanced at the door leading to the one bedroom. Guess Murg and Rav still think we're an item, he said. Guess so, she agreed, unable to meet his eyes. Well, I guess it's the pallet out here for me, Han said. Hey, Bria remonstrated. I'm a soldier. I've slept in mud holes before, with no blanket. No need to treat me like a lady, Han. She smiled and took out a desiccated piece. Tell you what, I'll flip you for the bed. Han grinned at her, his most charming smile. Okay, babe. Fine by me. Bria looked at him, and their eyes locked. Oh dear. She sounded as though she'd just run 4 or 5 clicks. Han was feeling a bit breathless himself. Oh dear what? He said, taking a step toward her. Bria smiled shakily. The galaxy is no longer safe for humanoid females, she said. You've learned what you can do with that lopsided smile, haven't you? As a matter of fact, Han did have some idea, and so did a number of women he could name. He took another 2 slow steps in her direction, and chuckled, genuinely amused. Hey, he said. There are times when it works better than my blaster. Bria was so tense he wondered if she were going to bolt, but she didn't move as he took another step toward her. Looking down, Han saw that her hand was shaking. Aren't you going to flip that thing? He asked softly. She nodded and took a deep breath, and her hand steadied a bit. Sure. Call it. You sure it's not a trick coin? Han asked, taking another step. Hey! She protested. It's a real desiccated. With mock indignation, Bria showed him the disc, twirling it to demonstrate that it was indeed a regular coin. On the obverse was the head of the Emperor, on the reverse was stamped the symbol of the Empire. Han took another step, and now he could have reached out and touched her shoulder. "Okay. I pick heads," he said quietly. Bria swallowed and flipped the coin, but she missed catching it, because she was shaking again. Han, however, did not miss. He caught the coin, held it without looking. "Heads, we share the bed," he said softly. "Tails, we share the floor." "But we agreed." She was stammering and trembling all over now. "Just business." Han tossed the coin over his shoulder, and in one lunge he pulled Bria into his arms. He kissed her with all the pent-up passion of the past days, and all those lost years. Kissed her mouth, her forehead, her hair, her ears, and then returned to her mouth. Finally, when he raised his head, he breathed. "I say, the heck with business, right?" "Right," she murmured, and then it was her turn to kiss him. She wound her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as he held her. Behind them, forgotten, the desiccated piece lay on the woven matting covering the floor, shining faintly in the dimness. The next morning, Han woke up smiling. He got up and went out to stand on the little balcony overlooking the beautiful Togorian garden. He breathed deeply, hearing the twittering of the tiny flying lizards, and remembered one alighting on Bria's finger all those years ago, that first time on the beach. He wished they had time to go back to that beach. "Hey," he thought, "when this Elysian thing is over, we'll have all the time in the world, and all the credits we could want. We'll come back here. Then maybe we'll head for the corporate sector, do some business. With the Falcon, we can go anywhere, do anything." He wondered whether Bria would actually leave the Resistance for him. After what they'd shared last night, he didn't see how she couldn't. They were good together, so good there was no way they'd be apart from now on. Han heard a step behind him, but didn't turn, only stood staring out at the garden, inhaling the spicy scent of the Togorian tree flowers. Arms slid around his waist, and he felt her hair against his back as she leaned against him. "Hey," she said quietly. "Good morning." "It's good, all right," he said quietly. "The best in a long time. 10 years, I think." "Did I tell you last night that I love you?" she murmured, kissing the back of his neck. "You need a haircut." "Several times," he replied. "But you can say it again if you want." "I love you." "Sounds good," he said. "I think you need more practice, though." "Try it again." She laughed. "You're getting a swelled head, Han." He chuckled, and turned to hold her. "You know, the Falcon is going to be so full of huge Togorians all the way back to the rendezvous coordinates, that you just might have to sit on my lap." "I could manage that," she said. Sarah proved to be extremely short for a Togorian, only about 2 meters tall. But he was in excellent condition, his muscles sliding beneath his sleek black fur like oiled cords. On their way back to the deep space rendezvous, Han swung by Nar Shaddaa to pick up Jarek and Chewbacca. He'd been wondering how Chewie and Murg would get along. When he introduced the Wookiee and the giant Togorian, Han was treated to the unusual sight of Chewie actually looking up at another being. Murg regarded the Wookiee assessingly, then said, "Greetings to Han Solo's friend. He tells me you are his brother in fur." Chewie roared softly, and Han translated. "Chewbacca sends greetings in return to Murg," he said. "He is honored to meet a brother in fur from the past, the hunter Murg." Solemnly, the two huge creatures regarded each other, then both turned to Han. He looked up at them, and could tell that they liked each other. "You guys," he said, "have got a lot in common." "Indeed," said Chewie. They had Han. "Any friend of Han Solo's is a friend of Murga's," the Togorian announced. Han heard the door signal to his apartment buzz, and opened it to find Lando standing there. For once the gambler wasn't dressed in the height of fashion, but in military-style rough fatigues, and he wore heavy boots. He was armed with a blaster and a blaster rifle. "Hey!" Han said. "What's up? You go into a war?" "I just heard about your little jaunt to Elysia," Lando said. "I want in. Can I ride along on the Falcon?" Han regarded his friend in surprise. "Pal, this ain't your kind of thing," he said. "We ain't expectin' much in the way of resistance from those Gamorrean guards on Elysia, but there's bound to be some shootin' dot." Lando nodded. "I'm a good shot," he said. "Han, I've almost got enough credits saved to buy a new ship, a real beauty of a sleek little yacht I've had my eye on. I figure for a share of that spice in the warehouses, this is worth a little risk to my precious hide. Another 10,000 credits, and that little beauty is mine." Han shrugged. "Okay by me," he said. "You're welcome to join the party." Thus, it was a very crowded, but thankfully short, flight back to the rebel rendezvous coordinates. The rebel fleet was mostly gathered by now, along with most of the smuggler vessels. Bria and the other rebel commanders conducted final briefings so that each smuggler and each rebel assault group knew exactly what part they would play in the attack. Each group of rebel assault shuttles had at least 3 or 4 smuggler ships to guide them down through the atmosphere. There were 9 colonies now on Elysia, and there were 9 attack forces, each commanded by a rebel commander like Bria. She'd chosen the toughest objective for herself, Colony 1. It boasted the largest warehouses, the most pilgrims, and the best defenses. But Bria was sure that Red Hand Squadron could handle it, especially with Han flying beside her. By now, Han was familiar with Jace Pale, Dano H. Wyax, and her other officers. He wondered if any of them realized that he and their commander were now a couple. The assassinations would be starting any time on Elysia, and the main attack was set for tomorrow morning, ship standard time, which had nothing to do with day or night on Elysia, when the pilgrims would be desperate for the exaltation, and amenable to taking orders from anyone who promised it to them. As Han and Bria ate supper that night in Retribution's galley, Han's attention was suddenly drawn to the external monitoring unit that showed the masses of gathering ships. A familiar shape, one he'd known from childhood, was moving into view. He stopped chewing, then swallowed hastily, and pointed. "Bria! That big old Liberator-class transport. Where'd you get it?" She looked at him and grinned. "Looks a bit familiar, doesn't it?" Han nodded. "I'd swear that's trader's luck. The ship I grew up on." She nodded. "It is. I was saving it for a surprise. The Corellian Resistance bought it a couple of years ago at scrap prices, and we've converted it into a troop carrier. We named it the Liberator." Han had heard that the vintage ship had been abandoned following Garrus Shrike's death. He looked at the old vessel, feeling his throat tighten. He was glad to know that the Liberator now had a new life. "You're going to use her to get the pilgrims shipped to safety, right?" "Many of them," she agreed. "Your old home will take them to a new life, Han." He nodded, and finished Lee's meal, his eyes seldom leaving the huge, antique vessel. Memories flooded him, memories of Delana, mostly. Since the Falcon boasted only a few sleeping bunks, Han decided to stay the night in Bria's cabin. They held each other close, each of them acutely aware that tomorrow they would be going into battle. And in battles, people died. "After tomorrow," Han whispered to her in the darkness, "we'll always be together. Promise me." "I promise," she said. "Together." He sighed and relaxed. Okay, he said. And, Bria? Yes? You watch your back tomorrow, sweetheart. He could tell she was smiling, from the way her voice sounded. I will. You too, okay? Sure. Hours later, Bria was awakened from a troubled doze by the soft chime of her cabin intercom. She came instantly alert, and pulling on a robe, went into her adjoining office. The communication officer on duty told her she had an incoming message. Send it through to me here, she said, pushing her hair back from her face. Moments later, Bria was facing her commanding officer, Pianat Torble. She stiffened to attention. Sir? Bria, just wanted to wish you luck tomorrow, he said. And to tell you. He hesitated. Yes? Tell me what? She prompted. I can't be specific. But our intelligence reports that the Empire has something big underway. Really big. Something that could crush the entire Rebel Alliance in 1 or 2 engagements. Bria stared at him, in shock. Some kind of secret fleet? She asked. I can't tell you, he reminded her. But bigger than that. Bria couldn't imagine what he was talking about, but she'd grown used to the need to know system long ago. Okay, so what does that have to do with this raid tomorrow? It's going to take everything we have, every resource we can muster, every credit we can scrape together, to deal with this, Torble said. Your mission was important before this, now it's critical. Take everything you can get, Bria. Weapons, spice, everything. Sir, that's my objective, she said, her heart beginning to thud. I know that. I just thought you should know. We're dispatching several intelligence teams to Raltier to try and find out more. They'll need credits for bribes, surveillance equipment, you know the drill. Of course, Bria said. Sir, I won't fail you. I know you won't, Torble said. I shouldn't have contacted you, perhaps, you're under enough pressure. But I thought you should know. I appreciate your telling me, sir. Thank you. Torble gave her a quick salute and broke the connection. Bria sat there in her office, wondering if she should go back to bed or just start the day early. She heard Han's voice, a little rough with sleep, from the other room. Bria? Everything okay? Everything's fine, Han, she called. I'll be there shortly. Rising, she paced slowly back and forth, remembering what he'd said to her earlier. They'd be together, always. Yes, we will, she thought. We'll be together. We'll guard each other's backs, and together we'll fight and we'll prevail against the Empire. And if we have to sacrifice to achieve that, we will. She knew that Han would understand about the treasure and the credits. He pretended to be such a mercenary, but at heart he wasn't, she knew that. Her mind once more at rest, her resolve firm, Bria went back to bed. Sunset at Elysian Colony 5. The ruddy rays of the low sun, breaking through 100 gaps in the massed clouds, were projected as pastel spikes across the sky. By the choppy waters of the Sea of Hope, the robe-clad pilgrims assembled on the beach cast long shadows across the sand. Patarza, head sacerdote of the colony, raised his ugly Tilanda till head and surveyed the crowd, his horns sweeping slowly back and forth as he did so. His bulbous eyes shone like blood as they bulged from his grayish, wrinkled flesh. After a moment, he brought up his diminutive arms, and the ceremony began. The one is all, he intoned in the rumbling, nasal heavy language of the Tilanda Till. 500 voices echoed the phrase back. The one is all. At that very moment, at Colony 4 on the other side of the planet, it was just after midnight. Dark clouds drifted across the moonless night sky, extinguishing stars, making the night even blacker. On the wall of the priest's quarters, there was a soft, chitinous scratching. Elysian vermin frantically darted away in all directions. Noi Wagla, small and bug-like herself, scuttled up the smooth permacrete and, barely pausing to chew a hole in the grating, through the window. She crouched poised on the sill. Below her, in the darkness, she could hear the sleeping noises of the priests she had come to kill. Jabba would pay well for this, enough that she might someday be able to return to her own species. The great creatures in their sleeping harnesses filled the small room, made it stink of musk. The Hyob crawled up the nearest rough-textured harness, and paused below the enormous head. The Tlandil shifted slightly, and she backed away, alarmed, but after a moment, the priest's snoring resumed. Wagla advanced even closer. This is going to be easy. Wagla seized a large vial strapped to her back in her formidable mandibles, pulled out the stopper with her palps. Jabba had tested the substance himself. A drop of the poison called Srejptin, placed on the Sacrodot's lower lip, would kill even the largest Tlandil in seconds, silently and without struggle. Retracting several of her legs, Wagla climbed toward the priest's mouth. "The all is one," intoned Patarza. "The all is one." IXFWA, Whippet assassin and bounty hunter, waited in the corridor leading to the underground mud baths of Colony 7. It had been a tedious few weeks, living as pilgrim, trying to blend in, when all his instincts called for getting it over with, hunting the ugly Mafrida down and escaping. But the bloated one had specified tonight as the time, and FWA wanted to collect his full fee. The sound of Tlandil voices echoed up from the dimness below, and FWA heard their characteristic shuffling gait. The assassin checked the two small holdout blasters he had smuggled into the compound. Fully charged, of course. He tensed, thinking that the credits he was about to become entitled to were not so much the prize of a hunt, so much as a gift. Security here in Colony 7 was lax beyond belief. FWA could see them coming now, and he pressed himself into a hollow in the uneven wall. As he'd expected, it was his targets, the three male Sacrodots. He could smell them, and his sensitive nostrils recognized the reek of the males. They were close now, coming closer, closer. FWA leaped out with a ferocious roar, blasters raised. "Aim for their eyes," he thought, as he fired his first salvo. "In service to the all, every one is exalted. Every one is exalted." Tuga Salpivo, down on his luck Corellian space tramp and jack of all trades, paused for a moment at the edge of the Elysian jungle and looked back. Colony 8 was a gray smudge in the very first light of dawn. Sunrise was still an hour away. Salpivo grinned and wiped the sweat off his face with a back-and-forth motion, catching a whiff of the vinegary vom powder residue on his hand. He couldn't wait to see the explosion. It was so quiet. Even the scraping and peeping of the Elysian jungle was gone. There was no wind at all. Salpivo forced himself not to blink as he waited. When the brilliant orange flame flowered from the Tlandil's sleeping chamber, there was a moment before the sound reached him, and he thought, "It doesn't seem real." Then the crack and boom rolled over him, almost knocking him down, followed by the cries and wails of the remaining inhabitants. "Job well done," he said to himself, chuckling. "I'll be back on Poita before the fire's put out." We sacrifice to achieve the all. We serve the one. Serve the one. The Rodian named Snickwick sniffed the air thoughtfully, his aqua snout wiggling. Mid-afternoon sun slanted down into the wide courtyard, and dust seemed to hang in the hot, thick air. With infinite care, he secured the last strand of monofilament fiber across the opening of the passageway to the factory compound. Colony 9 was not yet finished, but the main buildings and dormitories were close enough to completion to start up operation. Nearly 300 pilgrims were resident, most of them employed on the construction gang. Snickwick's had come in with the last bunch, his experience as a permacrete artisan coming in handy. Here they come! The Rodian stepped back from the invisible wire, then ducked under it, making sure he came nowhere near the deadly stuff. Once in the corridor, he made his way up to the first-level balcony, which overlooked the courtyard. The 60 Landatil, 3 males and 3 females, were returning from their post-siesta walkabout, ambling toward the dinner hall and their supper. A cadre of Gamorrean guards surrounded them, their axe heads glinting in the sun. Snickwix pulled the sound projector remote control from his little pouch, hefting the device and feeling the smoothness of its contours. I don't even have to get near them, he thought, delightedly. I love this assignment. I don't have to risk my delicate little neck. His ears twitched expectantly as he turned the dial to its maximum position and engaged the trigger. Suddenly, from the other side of the courtyard, a hideous, shrill wailing began, a sound so high it made Snickwick shiver. It was an ancient recording of the savage Thoda, the principal predator of the T-Landa-Til on their long-lost homeworld of Varl. The T-Landa-Til froze for a second, their protuberant eyes swinging in every direction as they tried to locate the source of the cry. The head Sacrodot, Tars by name, reared up onto his hind limbs and spun about, calling to the others, but it was no use. The huge creatures stampeded mindlessly in all directions, trampling Gamorreans as they headed for the openings in the courtyard wall that Snickwix had booby-trapped. Finally, even Tars panicked and dashed for the nearest exit. The Rodian, who had a taste for bloodshed, smacked his prehensile lips as the priests came apart, monofilament slicing them more cleanly than any blade. Tars got halfway through the opening before his upper torso peeled back, revealing the dark maroon interior, internal organs laid out side by side, blood pooling and spilling as he fell to complete the gash. In a trice, they were all dead, big pools of wine-red blood slowly spreading around the quartered corpses, and only a few dazed Gamorreans were left to try to figure out what had happened. Maybe this'll mean a promotion, Snickwix told himself. Jabba seems to like me already. All I have to do is stick with him. Prepare for the blessing of exaltation. Padarza took a step forward and sensed the priests on either side of him doing the same. The pilgrims broke ranks, pressing forward, falling over one another, uttering little whimpers of anticipation. Padarza began to inflate his neck pouch, scanning the expectant faces, when something caught his eye. There was a humanoid pilgrim pushing toward them, nothing unusual about that. However, instead of a pilgrim's cap, there was a dark hood thrown over his head. Padarza stared in fascination. The hood was empty. The thing was quite close now, he was sure of it. Suddenly the hood fell back and the headless thing pulled a weapon out of its robe. Nameless dread gnawed at the T-Landa-Til. He took a few steps back, bumped into one of his brothers. The robe fell to the ground, and the Sacrodot looked straight into the muzzle of a blaster, seemingly floating in the air. His thinking seemed fuzzy and oh so slow, but one thought came with crystal clarity. Oh. An ARA. Just an ARA. Then brightness fell from the air. At Colony 1, the oldest and largest of the Elysian faculties, only a few moments later, it was nearing midday. Teroenza sat in the shallow, squishy mud like a beach swalloden, hardly moving, eyes closed. The developments of the last day were discouraging beyond belief. Durga, curse him, had called his bluff. Teroenza opened his eyes and took in the depressing sight. Beyond Veritil and Tylena and the other T-Landa-Til soaking in the mud, sleek Nova Force ships littered the landing field, and small teams of heavily armed sentients wearing the uniform of the mercenary unit were everywhere. How could Durga have known what he planned? Maybe the young Hutt was smarter than he thought. Now that he reflected on it, Teroenza decided that it had probably been a bad idea to kill Kibik so brazenly. But the worst of it was that Teroenza still couldn't know for sure how much Durga knew. Perhaps the Nova Force troops were Durga's response to the High Priest's disingenuous request to beef up the Ilesian defenses. Maybe he didn't suspect foul play in Kibik's death. Teroenza liked that idea. If true, the Tlandatil would just have to wait, and hope that this situation was temporary, and that, after a while, Besadia would grow weary of paying Nova Force to stay here. Wait. I can wait a little longer. In any event, that's all I can do. The Nova Force Commandant, a squat, heavy-gravity world human named Willem Cameron, was approaching the edge of the flat, treading gingerly, not wanting to soil his shining black boots. Finally, he gave Teroenza a disgusted look and motioned for the Tlandatil to come to meet him. The High Priest decided that he'd at least pretend to cooperate until he found out more. Hoisting himself to his feet, Teroenza started in the man's direction. Without warning, a lash of energy sizzled into the mud in front of him, spattering him with ejecta. The High Priest halted in confusion. What? Teroenza turned to see three beings in camo uniforms come racing out of the jungle, blaster rifles blazing. The Gamorreans who had been guarding them were already dead. Sh. The sound of blaster fire was all around him. Teroenza tried to run, tried to change direction, but slipped in the mud, falling to his knees. Is this Nova Force? Has Durga ordered them to execute us now? Teroenza thought, hysteria nearly getting the better of him. At the edge of his vision, he saw that Cameron was also shooting now. But not at him. At the intruders. Other Nova Force soldiers were coming up behind him, blasting away. By Varl, they're trying to protect us. There was no place to run. Teroenza froze in panic. Veritil, he could see, lay motionless, a smoking hole wherein I used to be. Tylena had run deeper into the mud, but was unable to submerge herself, and was flailing back and forth in complete terror. Teroenza realized suddenly that it was only a matter of time. Taking a deep breath to still the fear erupting in his heart, he let himself fall, then lay still, playing dead. The blaster fire abruptly stopped, and Teroenza opened his eyes. It worked. The intruders lay dead. The High Priest dared to raise himself and survey the scene. Tylena! She was half covered by mud and water, and her head was under. She can't breathe. Before he had reached the body, Teroenza knew the truth. He cradled the massive head as best he could in his weak arms, trying to find a spark of life in his mate, but she was gone. Cameron had taken a hit in the arm, and his tan uniform was covered with dark brown smears. And there was Ganartios, Teroenza's majordomo, making his way through the milling soldiers, pausing for a moment at the mud's fringe, then plunging right in. "My lord Teroenza!" he cried, his weak old human's voice barely more than a croak. "It's terrible. All over the planet, assassins are killing our priests. We've had reports from colonies 2, 3, 5, and 9. Off-world communication has been cut. Oh, sir! Lord Veritil, and Tylena! Sir, what can we do?" He wrung his hands distractedly. "Sir, this is the end. There can be no more exultations. What shall we do?" Teroenza snorted heavily, trying to think. Was this Durga's work? No, it couldn't be. The Besadia enterprise depended on the Tlandatil. Who was responsible for this? And what should he do now? Jailus Nebel entered the Elysian atmosphere with great care, watching for storm cells, and staying in constant touch with the rebel assault shuttles that were following him. He was a lead ship, and well aware of his responsibility. Shuttle 3, he said into his comm unit, in his squeaky basic. Watch yourself. You're drifting too far to port. Storm Cell 311 is headed in your direction. The ionization from those lightning storms will mess up your instrumentation. Increase speed and close up. This is Shuttle 3, we copy, Dream of Freedom. They were flying through thick clouds now, and the Dream was buffeted by high winds. Darkness surrounded them. They were flying toward the sun, but they would not reach daylight before they landed. The Celestin checked his instruments. Titan formation, he ordered. All ships Titan formation. He saw the running lights of his starboard wingman for a moment, then the clouds blotted them out. They were being slammed by gusts, and the clouds were so thick that Nebel didn't even bother to glance at his view screen. Instruments only flying. Rain and hail and electrical storms raged nearby, lighting the inky clouds in actinic flashes. Nebel followed the progress of his formation on his tactical sensors. It had been 10 years since Nebel had flown through the Elysian atmosphere, but he was surprised how it all came back to him. He was leading half the rebel ships assigned to Colony 1 in, and Han Solo was leading the other half in the Millennium Falcon. Han had taken his Celestin friend for a brief tour of his ship yesterday, and the two pilots had caught up on old times while Nebel enjoyed watching Han show off his pride and joy. Nebel spotted another storm cell, pointed it out to his formation, and then sent his ship swooping down, automatically checking his landing vector. His assigned landing spot was directly in the middle of the Colony 1 compound. He was carrying a squad of troops, and their assignment was to secure the Endress factory. As he flew, Nebel could hear the assault commander aboard the transport Liberator, reporting on the fleet's progress. The rebel forces had taken the Elysian space station, having met heavier resistance than expected, but they were now reporting in that it was secured. Nebel stayed in close touch as he led his formation down. He was tracking the storm cells so the more inexperienced pilots wouldn't have to. In theory at least, if they followed Nebel's lead, they'd be able to concentrate on their piloting as opposed to their navigation. They were almost down below the heaviest cloud layer now. Colony 1 was still in darkness, though dawn would arrive in about an hour. Nebel noticed that his rightmost shuttle was falling behind, and quickly established contact. Assault Shuttle 6, you're falling behind. What's happening? Having trouble with a stabilizer. The young pilot's voice was strained. I've got my co-pilot working on it. Formation, reduce speed. We don't want to lose Shuttle 6. Nebel ordered. Obediently, they reduced speed. The next voice Nebel heard over the comm was Han Solo's. Hey Nebel, what gives? You're slowing. The Celestin explained the problem. Well, I don't want to go in ahead of you, so I'll drop back too, Han said. The Falcon and her ship slowed, falling back, leaving Nebel, as planned, still in the lead. Both groups were still in good formation when they dropped below the cloud cover and saw the nighttime lights of Colony 1. Nebel was in the lead, and he'd repositioned Shuttle 6 so it was now beside him, so he could nursemaid the rebel pilot down. Nebel's other ships were flying half a ship's length behind the Dream and 6 as they swooped toward their assigned landing coordinates. Nebel had almost no warning. 1 second he was heading for his landing coordinates, everything fine, and the next his sensors suddenly blacked out a warning. Glancing down, Jailus Nebel saw that he'd been targeted by a heavy turbolaser. What? He thought blankly. Where? The explosion was so massive, so all-consuming, That poor Nebel never even had time to realize he'd been hit. Han Solo watched with horror as Dream of Freedom and Assault Shuttle 6 were simply eradicated by 2 blasts from a ground-mounted heavy turbolaser. The turbolaser blasted again, and 2 other shuttles performed frantic evasive maneuvers that caused them to run straight into a treacherous wind shear. Their stubby wings impacted, and then, flaming, they hurtled down toward the jungle. Fireballs painted the darkness with crimson, marking the crash sites. Han was frozen with shock for a half-second. A turbolaser. Where'd that come from? Then he checked his position, and those of the ships in formation with him, and began his own evasive. At the same time he activated his comm, shouting, "Formations 1 and 2, veer off! Bria, order your ships to their alternate landing sites. Veer off! They got a heavy turbolaser down there. Nebel bought it." Without waiting for a response, Han swooped the Falcon up on her side and changed his approach vector, and not a moment too soon. A wash of fatal green energy streaked toward his ship, narrowly missing her belly. Han saw a damage control warning light up on his board, and realized the shot had knocked out the extension and retraction controls on his new retractable blaster. The close brush had also managed to fry the terrain-following sensors. He swore, even as Chewie howled. Han heard shouts from Jarek, who was in the ventral gun turret and must have gotten a spectacular, and terrifying, view of the blast. Too close for comfort. He peeled away, accelerating to get well out of the range of the turbolaser. None of the other ships was hit, thankfully. The alternate landing sites were on the beach, more than 2 kilometers from the center of Colony 1. Han brought the Falcon in for a landing, setting her down on the hard-packed sand, not far from the breakers. He sat there for a second, just breathing hard, enveloped by the Elysian darkness. He kept his lights on, so none of the other pilots would be tempted to land on top of him. To his right as he sat in the cockpit, were the dunes, and beyond them, the mudflats and Colony 1. To his left was the Zoma Kawanga, which, in Huttese, meant Western Ocean. Behind and before him stretched the beach, and already other ships were settling into place. Leaving Chewie to finish up their post-landing checks, Han keyed his comm. "Shuttle 1, this is the Falcon." "Bria, this is Han." "Come in, Shuttle 1." A crackle of static, then her voice. Han let out a sigh of relief. He'd lost track of formation a bit back there, and while he thought Shuttle 1 wasn't one of the ships hit, he hadn't been positive until now. "Han, I read you. Shuttle 1 landing now, alternate site. I'm going to deploy my troops for the ground attack. We'll go in over the dunes. My squad will head through the jungle for the compound." "I'm coming with you," Han said. "Don't go without me." "Copy, Falcon." She hesitated. "Han, we need to secure the admin building. Can you take care of dispatching the Togorian squad?" Han knew she was thinking about the treasure room. The plan all along had been for Murg, who knew the layout and the jungle, to lead his squad of Togorians in there. But now they'd have to go a lot farther. "Right," he said. "I'll do that." Han went back to the lounge, where the Togorians were unstrapping, checking the charges in their weapons, and commenting to each other about rough rides. They wanted to know why all the stomach-churning aerial acrobatics. Han spent a minute explaining, then went on to tell Murg, Mrav, Sarah and the other Togorians that they'd landed much farther from their target than anticipated. "This will be tougher than we originally planned," Han said. "You're going to have to make about a 2-kilometer hike through the jungle." Murg stood up, careful not to whack his head in the cramped surroundings of the Falcon's lounge. "Do not worry, Han," he said. "Murg will lead the way through the jungle to the administration building. Muir hunted all around Colony 1, and Muir remembers terrain well. Han pulled on his infrared goggles and his light helmet, picked up his weapons, then he and Chewbacca followed the Togorian squad down the ramp. Han watched their bright yellow images make their way up the beach. He pushed up his goggles, and was instantly engulfed in complete darkness. The Togorians had vanished like shadows into the surrounding blackness. The Corellian took a deep breath of the late night air, and the smell of the Elysian Ocean brought back a rush of memories. "Chewie," he said, "stay sharp. This world can be a real pit. Good thing it ain't rainin' for once." He tapped his goggles. "You need a pair of these, pal?" Chewie shook his head, affirming that Wookiee night sight was far superior to human vision. He could see fine and didn't need goggles. When Han turned to go up the landing ramp, Lando and Jarek came trooping down it. Like Han, they were carrying heavy blaster rifles and wearing helmets with infrared goggles. They stood together at the bottom, watching the rebel soldiers assembling from the shuttles. Most of the landing vehicles were down now. "So, where do you guys think you're going?" Han asked. "To find some action," Jarek said. "I ain't missing this." The youth clutched his blaster rifle, bouncing on his toes, obviously excited at the chance to take part in his first ground assault. Han had always figured he'd let Jarek stay in the ship. Safer that way. "Wait a minute," he said. "The Togorians are gone to capture the admin building. Me and Chewie are heading out with Bria. If you guys go looking for action, then who's gonna guard the Falcon?" "Lock it and activate the security systems," Jarek said. "Nobody's gonna get inside unless you let them, Han." Lando gestured at the beach. The last rebel and smuggler ships were coming in for a landing. "Won't Bria post a rear guard to watch the ships?" Han glared at the gambler. Lando suddenly realized he was being a bit dense, and shut up. Smugglers were pouring out of their vessels now, and several of the captains were plainly not happy. Han braced himself as Kai Nednak and Arlie Braun stormed up to him, along with several other smugglers and privateers he didn't know. "Solo, what do you think you're doing, leading us straight into a turbolaser?" Braun demanded. "I nearly lost my engines." Han shrugged and spread his hands. "Hey, it's not my fault. I didn't know. I almost got fried myself." Just then, Bria approached, with Jace Pale, her second in command. "It's not Han's fault," she said to the unhappy crowd. "I am going to have a word with the Bahans, though. They were supposed to have done the recon necessary for this mission. Unless that turbolaser was just installed, they should have pinpointed it before now." More grumbling from the assembled captains. Bria held up her hand for quiet. "Don't worry, you'll get what's coming to you," she said, her voice and eyes hard and full of authority. "Just stay here on the beach until we have the compound secured. Or, anyone who enjoys a fight is welcome to tag along." Most of the smuggler and privateer captains shook their heads and walked away, but one or two decided to go in with the rebels, probably to make sure they got to earmark the best spice in the warehouse for themselves. Han looked at Bria. "Chewie and me are going with you," he said. Jace Pale spoke up. "Commander, request permission to take my squad in and knock out that turbolaser. We're going to need to land more shuttles later on, and we can't, with that thing blasting ships out of the sky." Bria nodded. "Permission granted, Lieutenant. Take a demo team with you. Take out the laser, and if it can't be salvaged, destroy it." "Right, Commander." "Jarek Solo here." "I'd like to go." Jarek spoke up to Pale. "That laser nearly singed my rear. I'd like a chance to be in on taking it down." Pale nodded at the young man. Glad to have you. Han caught Lando's eye and jerked his head at Jarek. Lando sighed, then stepped forward. Count me in too, Lieutenant. I'm Lando Calrissian. Glad to have you, Calrissian. Han waved at his friends as they started off down the beach with Pale's squadron. He watched as Bria gave final orders to the troops who would remain behind as rear guard for the ships on the beach. Then he and Chewie started up the beach with Bria and her troops. Her comlink chirped, and she turned it up so she could hear. Han listened to the voice of the assault commander, Blevin, up on the Liberator. Rainbow 1 to all stations, we have multiple reports of heavy resistance. Be on the alert. Bria glanced at Han, then at her chrono. All forces have landed. We're running behind. She muted the comlink so it was just a distant mutter of commanders reporting in, then broke into a jog. Han and the squads ran after her. The infrared goggles took some getting used to. Han nearly tripped over beach drift, and once he got tangled in a bunch of thorny sand grass and got thoroughly scratched. Chewie obligingly lifted him up bodily, freeing him. His skin stinging, Han warned the others behind him. Been a long time, he reflected, scrambling behind Bria up the dune, clutching the heavy A280 rifle. Sand sifted and fell around him, and the footing was treacherous. The last time he'd done something like this was not a pleasant memory. Bria was the first to reach the top. She flattened herself, waving caution with a hand signal to her followers. Han wasn't expecting any fire. After all, they were not even in sight of the compound, but caution in battle was always a good thing. He dropped to his belly and wriggled up beside her, with Chewie right behind him. Sand sifted down his open collar, making him itch. He couldn't spare the time to scratch, though. Together, Han, the Wookiee and Bria eased up the last half-meter and peered over the top of the dune. And nearly got the tops of their heads blown off. Repeating blaster fire hammered them, turning some of the sand to glass instantly, spraying them with minuscule hot particles that stung like insects. Chewie howled as Han and Bria threw themselves flat, covering, until the fire ceased. The rebel commander took a sensor reading and looked at Han, her face a yellowish blur with white lips against the varied greens of the infrared. He could see her frown beneath the masking goggles. Han, I'm detecting at least 20 energy signatures out there, waiting for us. Whoever these guys are, they're not a bunch of Gamorreans. Han stared at her. That and the turbo laser. Yeah. She thumbed her comlink to transmit. Rainbow 1, this is Red 1. We took turbo laser fire as we landed and changed to our alternate landing site. We're on the ground with moderate casualties. 4 ships lost, 3 shuttles, 1 friend. Friend, Han knew, was the agreed-upon code for a smuggler or privateer's ship. Encountering heavy resistance, but continuing our assault. The voice of Assault Command came back. Rainbow 1 copies, Red 1. Do you need White 1? Blevin was asking whether Bria needed reserves from the Liberator. She keyed her link. Negative, Rainbow 1. The reserves can't land while that turbo laser is still up. We're working on it. Red 1 out. Rainbow 1. Blevin acknowledged her, and then was quiet. Bria switched frequencies to her inter-squad channel. Jace, this is Bria. Have you sneaked a look over those dunes yet? I did. Pale's voice was grim. Who are those guys? I don't know, Bria said. But they're obviously professionals. You circle around through the jungle and come down the mudflats from the north. I'll go through the jungle and come up from the south. We'll catch them in a crossfire. Copy, Pale said. You would make me crawl through the mud. Bria laughed grimly and broke the connection. It took Han and Bria's team nearly 10 minutes to make their way far enough down the beach so they could be sure to be shielded by the jungle. They went up and over the dunes, then down again, into the jungle. Han followed Chewie's lead as they slogged through rotting vegetation. His nose wrinkled at the smell, and Chewbacca whined protestingly. Wookiees had a much more acute sense of smell than humans. Sweating and slipping through the muck underfoot, Han wished he'd worn boots with more traction. Finally, they reached the edge of the cleared area. Bria's sensors confirmed that their targets were just ahead. They crouched in the jungle and her comm link chirped softly. She turned the volume up. Receiving multiple reports of heavy resistance. Green 1 reports confirmation that some professionals for a merc outfit calling itself Nova Force have been captured. Rainbow 1 out. Nova Force? Mercenaries? Han looked at Bria. Oh, great! How'd they get here? She shrugged. Han scowled. And I told the smugglers and privateers this was going to be a piece of cake. Han listened tensely as she checked in with Jace Pale. Everything was in place. Han's pulse was racing. He swallowed, and his saliva tasted metallic. You ready, pal? He whispered to Chewie, who was checking the charge in his bowcaster. HRRNNNNN. Han checked the charge in his blaster rifle, even though he knew it was full. Finally Bria nodded, and together, the squad wriggled out of the jungle, crawling along cropped vegetation, their hands and knees digging into the muck. It had rained recently, of course. This was Ilesia. Han's fingers encountered permacrete. A landing field or road, it hadn't been there 10 years ago. Bria counted down seconds with Pale, then. Fire! Han rose to his knees, sighted with his goggles, and saw a dim shape wearing an unfamiliar helmet, yellow marking body heat. He fired. The waning night exploded into blaster fire, choked off screams and battle cries. Still firing, Han and Chewbacca moved forward with Bria's troops. The soldier to his left went down. He glanced at her, saw a black hole where her face had been, whiffed charred meat, and kept going. Moments later, as the enemy fire stuttered out and died, Bria yelled for ceasefire. Han and Chewie approached, seeing the scattered bodies before them. Bria nudged one with her toe as Jace Pale, as smeared with mud as a T-Landa till after a wallow, approached. Look at that emblem on the sleeve, she said. An exploding star. And look at their armor and equipment. Professionals, all right. She counted bodies. 20. There are probably more manning the turbo laser. She and Han looked across the compound. In the pre-dawn darkness, they could make out the tower with the turbo laser atop it. Good thing they can't swing that thing down to hit targets on the ground, Han said. Or we'd be cooked. Jarek and Lando came up and the four friends stood off to the side as Bria ordered a few members of her squads to assist the wounded back to the ships, and to salvage the Nova Force weapons. Remember, people, she said, we are taking it all. If it can be reused, salvage it. They nodded. Han looked at Lando and Jarek, crusted with mud, and shook his head. Lando, if Dre Renthal could see you now. Chewie began laughing. Shut up, Han. You too, Chewbacca, the gambler said, flicking fastidiously at his ruined clothes. Luckily for him, he donned rough clothing in preparation for the night's work. I don't want to hear it. I haven't been this dirty since, well, it's a long story. Han chuckled, and looked at Jarek. So, how'd you do, kid? Jarek nodded. Pretty good, I think, Han. I got at least 2 of them. Han clapped him on the shoulder. Great. We'll make a warrior out of you yet. Jarek's teeth flashed white in his mud-blackened face. As soon as the wounded were taken away by medics, Bria keyed her comm link, then ordered her waiting troops to advance on the double. Let's take that compound! Advance in squads. Demo teams, be ready. She turned up the volume on the comm link, and they heard. Rainbow 1, this is Green 2. I'm assuming command here. Green 1 is down. Rainbow 1 copies Green 2. What's your status? Almost done here. Just mopping up. Expect to have the target secure in 5 minutes. Bria made a face. We're running behind. She clicked on. Rainbow 1, this is Red 1. Frontline resistance has been dealt with. Bringing up reinforcements, and advancing into the compound. Red 1, status on that turbo laser? Rainbow 1, I have 2 squads preparing to deal with that now. Red 1 out. Rainbow 1 out. Han and Chewie watched Pale's group as they headed off through the jungle to come at the turbo laser crew from the east. Then they were busy, advancing with Bria's troops into the compound. They met scattered resistance from Ilesian guards, which, for the most part, they dealt with easily, as they'd expected to. The night was no longer silent, even when the guns were quiet. The moans and pleas of the wounded, yells for assistance, plus assorted shouted alien words. As they advanced, Bria's squads kept reporting in. Red Hand Leader Squad 3 reporting. Andrus Factory secured. Demo teams are moving in. Red Hand Leader Squad 6 reporting. Welcome Center secured. Demo team has been summoned. Red Hand Leader Squad 7, we are moving in on the dormitory. It is under guard by the mercs, but there are only about 6 of them. Not expecting any trouble. Red Hand Leader Squad 2 reporting. We're moving into position to take that turbo laser. Estimate attack will commence in 5 minutes. Han and Chewie stayed close by Bria's side, as the 3 guarded each other's backs. Bursts of blaster fire echoed through the compound, mixed with screams, Gamorrean grunts and squeals, and alien wails. Han figured that there were probably a platoon's worth of mercenaries, 30 to 40 troopers, all told. The Nova Force soldiers were truly professional. They fought bravely and well until it was obvious that defeat was inevitable, then they surrendered. They were fighting for credits, not a cause, and it made sense to live and fight another day. Once a crazed pilgrim toting a scavenged blaster pistol came leaping out of the shadows and nearly winged Bria. Han shot the female Bahan down, killing her. He was rushed, and had no time to aim for a disabling shot. Bria stared down at the pilgrim in horror, and for a moment Han thought he saw tears in her eyes. "Honey," he said. "There was nothing else I could do." "I know." She gave him a wan smile. "It's hard, though, having them attack you when you're trying to help them." Han patted her shoulder consolingly. She took out her comm link in response to a chirp from Assault Command and heard the ID. Rainbow 1. A minute crawled by. Bria motioned her squad to fall in behind her. Then the AC channel spoke again, an outwardly calm voice that carried an undercurrent of strain. Rainbow 1, this is Blue 1. I need some help here. Levin's voice was flat. Blue 1, say your status. 30% casualties, and they've got us pinned down with repeating blasters, at least 2 of them. One in the warehouse, the other in the dormitory. I need White 1. Blue 1, this is White 1. I can drop 2 platoons in 3 minutes. Where do you want them? Why don't you take the warehouse? Put 1 platoon north, just on the south side of Hill 3-1. Land the other in the jungle to the east, and hit them from the side. I'll take the dormitory. Sounds good to me. Blue one. White one out. Blue one out. Bria looked over at the turbo laser. The first flush of dawn was brightening the sky. Jace should be moving in any moment. As if her words had been a signal, the area around the turbo laser erupted with blaster fire, shouts, screams, and the sounds of at least 2 grenades launching. Explosions filled the air. Bria waited a few tense seconds, then activated her link. Squad 2, report. Are you in? Have you got it? No reply. Han and Chewie looked at each other tensely as they sheltered beside the Glitterstim factory. One of Bria's troops came trotting around from the rear of the building. We're all secured, Commander. I've called for a demo team. She nodded distractedly. Good work, SK Cot. Squad 2, this is Red Hand Leader. Report, please. What's happening? Silence for 10 endless heartbeats. Then suddenly they heard the channel click. Red Hand Leader Squad 2. It was Jace Pale's voice. The troops around Han and Chewie grinned and gave a low cheer. We've got it, but we have people down. Send the medics. Out. Bria hastily called in backup for Squad 2, then summoned in the medic shuttle, telling them it was safe to fly into the compound. She called into her comm link. Squad 8, how are you Togorians doing? A voice came over the comm link, speaking accented but understandable basic. Brav here. The building is almost secured, Bria. We are going to have to search the jungle for snipers, though. Some of the guards managed to get away. There are some ships landed up here, mostly small shuttles, but one big one. We have the ships under guard. It's possible some of the guards may try to escape. Bria addressed the comm link. Great going, Mrav. I bet you people made short work out of those Gamorreans. Mrav growled an amused laugh. Bria switched channels, just in time to hear. Red 1, this is Rainbow 1. Say your status? Bria had just opened her mouth to reply when blaster fire erupted from the center of the compound, aimed at them. Bria, Han, Chewie, and the other squad members dropped, covering against the wall. Han spat out a mouthful of mud, and wished he could rinse his mouth out with the water from the flask on his hip. But he didn't want to chance moving. Cover me, people! Bria yelled over her shoulder, then she began worming her way forward. Han and Chewie were right behind her. Blaster fire began wanging past, over their heads. She turned, glanced back, saw him. Stay back! She hissed. I can handle this. I know you can, Han yelled. I just want to watch. For the first time ever, he heard her swear. She took careful aim with her blaster rifle, then, when the target came up from behind a vehicle, squeezed off around. The guard went down and lay motionless. Good shooting! Han applauded. Together, they ran back into cover with the troops. Bria spotted the comm link she dropped, picked it up. Red 1, this is Rainbow 1, say your status. Levin's voice was still calm. Bria was calm, but a little winded. This is Red 1. The turbo laser has been knocked out, and we hold most of the factories. We're attacking the warehouse and dormitory right now. Should be done in 10 minutes. Understood, Red 1. Will you need White 1? I don't think so, Rainbow 1. We're beating them. Rainbow 1 copies. They waited, listening tensely. Then, Rainbow 1, this is Gold 1. Objective secure. Rainbow 1, copy that. A minute later they heard. Rainbow 1, this is Orange 1. Target is secured. Rainbow 1. Copy that. The other commanders from all the colonies except Colony 3 reported in, one by one. By that time, Bria had checked in with all her people. Rainbow 1, she said. This is Red 1. Report target is secure here. Rainbow 1, copy that. We still haven't heard from Colony 3, Bria said worriedly. They're the ones who needed backup. Hope everything's okay. As if in answer to her concern, a different voice spoke up. Rainbow 1, this is White 1, reporting from Colony 3. Target is secure. Blevin said. Acknowledged, White 1. Where's Blue 1? The new voice was bleak. She's dead. Bria looked up. Well, that's it. Ilesia is ours, gentles, except for mopping up. Let's call in those ships. Han turned to Chewbacca and pulled the Wookiee aside. Chewie, I need you to do something right now, he said. Arn? We've got this area secured, but it sounds like Mrav and Murg could use some help up in the admin building, where the treasure room is. I want you to check on them, make sure they've got it secured, give them a hand if they need it. Your night vision is about as good as a Togorian's, and if they're chasing some of those guards through the jungle, you could be a big help, and you know it. HRRHHHHH. Chewbacca, as usual, took a dim view of being separated from his partner. Come on, Han said. I'm worried that some of those guards might break in and start stealing Taroan's collection. That's our stuff, remember? Chewie grumbled, but his resistance was weakening. Listen up, furball, Han snapped. I don't have time to argue. I trust Murg and Rav, but I don't know those other Togorians. And all it would take is one busy guard who managed to break in. So you help Murg and Rav secure the place, make sure the treasure room is still locked up, and come straight back. Shouldn't take you half an hour. You remember the location of the treasure room on that plan I sketched for you? HRNNNNNNN. Good. Get your furry butt in gear. Chewbacca was not happy, but the Wookiee departed without further argument. By now, ships were dropping from the pink-tinged sky like metal rain, landing in the center of the compound. Han was just taking a swig of water from his flask when a dark figure ran toward him. Han pushed up his goggles, squinted in the wan pre-dawn light, and realized it was Lando. Even before he saw the gambler's face, Han knew something was wrong. He hurried toward his friend. Han, it's Jarek. Kid took a hit. He isn't going to make it. He's calling for you. Blast! Together they ran. Lando led him over to the temporary aid station the medics had set up, then pointed to a stretcher. Han walked over, lip down, and recognized Jarek's unruly hair, and that was practically all. The young man's face was a scorched, reddened horror. At first Han thought he was dead, then he saw that Jarek was still breathing. He looked up hopefully at the nearest medic. The Alderaanian shook her head grimly, mouthed, Sorry. Hey, Jarek, can you hear me? Han took the grimy hand in his, grasped it firmly. Kid, it's Han. Jarek no longer had much in the way of eyelids, and Han knew he must be blind. But he turned his head slightly, and his mouth moved. Han! Don't try to talk, you're gonna be fine. They'll pop you in a back-to-tank, and you'll be chasing girls and shooting imps in no time. A faint thread of expel there, and Han recognized it as the ghost of a laugh. Liar! Han got to tell you. Han swallowed. Yeah? I'm listening. My name, it ain't. Solo. Lied to you? Han cleared his throat. Yeah, I know, kid. That's okay. I give it to you. Far as I'm concerned, you earned it long ago. You knew? Sure. I've known from the beginning, Jarek. The lax fingers tightened once, and then released. Han leaned over, checked for a pulse, then gently released his grip and stood up. His eyes were stinging, and it took him a second to regain control. The medic bustled by, and Han grabbed her sleeve. He's gone. Where's his ID? She handed him a comm chip. Han took it, then keyed in. Jarek Solo. Under the name of deceased field. The medic called for help, and 2 labor droids trundled forward. Han watched as they efficiently wrapped the dead youth in the sheet, then carried him over to the row of bodies laid out neatly on the ground. Before he could turn away, they were putting another wounded rebel onto the stretcher. Water, the woman croaked. Han took out his flask. You're gonna be okay, he said, as he helped her to drink. Don't worry. The woman drank thirstily. Thanks. She slumped back onto the stretcher. That's okay, Han said. What's your name? Lindila Genwald. She muttered and winced. My arm hurts. We'll get you some help, Han promised, and went in search of a medic. Satisfied that Genwald was getting the attention she needed, he left the aid station and joined Lando, who looked at him sadly. Han, I'm sorry. I tried to look after him, but they launched a grenade and I had to hit dirt, and the next thing I knew... The gambler broke off, shaking his head. Han nodded. I know what it's like. There wasn't anything you could have done, Lando. Don't beat yourself up. Han took a deep breath. He was a good kid. Yeah. Lando broke off as both humans heard a familiar roar. Han hastily waved at Lando and went running away from the aid station toward Chewbacca. The Wookiee, seeing that Han was still unharmed, grabbed Han's shoulder and ruffled his hair in a Wookiee greeting. Han took a deep breath. Chewie pal, he said. Brace yourself. Jarek bought it. The Wookiee stared at him for a moment, then threw back his head and voiced a roar of mingled rage and grief. Han silently echoed his friend's distress. Chewbacca pulled Han out of the way, began gesturing and growling emphatically. Mrav? Han said. Wounded? She gonna make it? Chewie wasn't sure, but he thought so. I gotta go find Murg, Han said. Tell you what, Chewie, you go get the Falcon, fly her over to that apron by the admin building. Then we'll be ready to load her up. Chewie nodded and loped away. In moments his tall form was lost to view amid the hurrying troops, dodging between the parked shuttles and tramp freighters. Han looked back for Lando, but his friend was gone. He went back to the aid station, asked where the Togorians were being cared for. The medic he questioned didn't know. It took 3 tries for Han to find out. Finally, he was directed to another auxiliary aid station, where most of the non-humanites were being treated. Han saw Murga's huge black shape crouching beside a pallet, and hurried over. Hey, Murg! The Togorian turned at the sound his voice, then leaped up and grabbed Han in a fierce hug. Murg is glad to see Han Solo. They are taking us up now, and Murg did not wish to go without saying farewell. Han looked down at Mrav. A bandage covered half her head. What happened? Murg and Mrav were on guard at the landing field, and 3 Gamorreans rushed us. She took 2 hits from a force pike before Murg tore her attacker's throat out. Oh, hey, pal. I'm so sorry, Han said. She's gonna be okay, isn't she? She has lost the eye. Murg said. And Medic says perhaps her hand must come off. He does not know. But she will live. And she will take pride in knowing that the slaves are free, the priests are dead. Han nodded, and couldn't think of anything to say. The medics approached with an anti-grav pallet, and loaded the wounded Togorian female onto it. Han walked with Murg to the medical shuttle, watched as Mrav was loaded in, and gave Murg a last, silent hug goodbye. After watching the shuttle lift off, Han turned back toward the big spice warehouse, figuring that was where he'd find Bria. Seeing Jace Pale hurrying by, Han asked the lieutenant where she was. Pale jerked a thumb back at the pilgrim's dormitory. Han jogged over that way, then paused, midway between the warehouse and the dormitory. Rebel troops were herding pilgrims out of the dorm, and the dazed, frightened slaves were plainly on the verge of panic. Bria stood before them, a microphone in her hand, and addressed them. "Listen to me," she called. "The priests are all dead. You are free now, and we've come to help you." "They killed the priests," one old man shouted, and began to sob. Wails and moans filled the air. "Just get on these shuttles quickly," Bria said. "We have medics and medications to help you feel better. We can cure you." The crowd grew increasingly restive. Another moment and there will be a riot, Han thought uneasily. It was obvious that Bria wasn't getting through to them at all. "We want exaltation," one shouted, and the next moment, they were all chanting and waving their fists in the air. "We want exaltation." Bria waved at the shuttles. "Just get on the shuttles. We'll help you. We want exaltation." The crowd surged forward, and Bria, with a disgusted air, signaled her troops. They opened fire with stun beams, and pilgrims began collapsing in droves. Having been stunned a few times himself, Han's body ached in sympathy for the pilgrims, and he was a bit shocked by Bria's ruthlessness in ordering her troops to simply shoot the slaves. But there wasn't much point in saying anything about it, he decided. As he stood there hesitating, watching the labor droids begin loading limp pilgrims into the shuttles, Bria turned away and saw him. Han waved, and she ran toward him. He grabbed her, hugged her fiercely, so relieved that they'd both made it through alive. "Jarek?" she asked. Han shook his head. "No," he said. "He didn't make it." "Oh, Han. I'm so sorry." Wrapping his arms around Bria, Han held her close, kissed her, and felt her kiss him back. They stood wrapped together in the midst of chaos. Finally, she pulled away and said, "It's time to head for the admin building. We've got to see to the treasure room." Han nodded. "Chewie's got the Falcon up there by now, ready to load her up," he said, looking around. The sun was up by now, and the scene before him was organized chaos with rebel troops everywhere. Bria tugged at him, but Han didn't move. "Where's Lando?" he asked. "He was here a few minutes ago." "Did he go to pick up his share of the spice?" "Come on," she urged. Han looked over at the warehouse, figuring that Lando would probably be right there, waiting to get his share. He spotted him, and took a step toward the warehouse, only to have Bria pull him back. "No! Come on, we have to go." Han's eyes narrowed. "There's something funny going on in there," he said. He could see Lando, and Arlie Braun and Kai Nen Mac and about 6 other smuggler captains standing there, near the open doorway of the warehouse. Just standing there. Not moving. Han looked at Lando, and Lando looked back, but the gambler didn't move. "Come on." Han started toward the warehouse, then stopped in surprise and dismay. Now he could see what was resting beside the door, covering the smugglers. A heavy repeating blaster on its tripod, with a rebel soldier standing behind it. And posted at intervals, 3 additional rebel guards, all with their weapons trained on the smugglers. What in blazes is going on? Han demanded, swinging around to confront Bria. What are you doing? She bit her lip. I hoped you wouldn't find out, she said. It would have been easier. Han, I got my orders last night. There's something really big going on, and we need every credit we can scrape up. Everyone is going to have to make sacrifices. The smuggler captains are being held hostage for a little while. Their crews are being allowed to pick up the unprocessed spice, but we have to take the prime stuff. We need it, Han. I'm sorry, but I don't have any choice. Han's mouth dropped open, and he glanced back over his shoulder to see other smugglers glaring at him. Oh, blast! He thought. They think I was in on this from the beginning. What was he to do now? Give up his own share in the treasure room, to side with the smugglers? Most of them wouldn't lift a finger to help him out, if their positions were reversed. Han knew that. Besides, he didn't know any of them that well. Except Lando. Han shook his head and looked at Bria. Honey, why didn't you tell me what you were planning? Because you would never have gone along with it, she said. But Lando is my friend. Han shrugged. The rest of them, I barely know. But Lando. Come on, she said. Your share of the treasure room is yours to do with as you please. If you feel bad, give Lando his share later. Han thought that over, and then sighed. I'll make it up to you, Lando, he thought. The Corellian shrugged mentally as he walked away with Bria, leaving the smugglers behind. I don't like this, but what else can I do? He reflected that it was a good thing that Chewie wasn't here. The Wookiee had an overactive conscience. When Han and Bria reached the admin building, they found Chewie waiting for them, and the Falcon on the apron. Chewie demanded to know where Lando was, and Han hesitated. He's going back with Arlie, he said after a second. Fortunately, Chewie was too taken up with the treasure room to notice Han's discomfiture. Han had picked up a small thermal detonator from the rebel arsenal, and it was the work of a moment to blow the door. He stepped inside, and stood there in shock. Most of the shelves were already stripped bare. Wah! Teroenza must have been getting ready to clear out. Bria exclaimed, pointing. Look, it's already boxed up for us. The big rear cargo door of the treasure room stood ajar, as though some of the treasure had already been loaded, but Han didn't see a ship out there. He figured that Teroenza had summoned a ship, only to fall prey to the assassins yesterday. All right. He shouted, and swung Bria around. Thank you, Teroenza. He gave her a short but passionate kiss, then turned back to regard the boxes of booty. Okay, we'll need a repulsor lift dolly, he said. There's one aboard the Falcon. Chewie, you. Don't move, Solo, came a voice from the past. Han froze as Teroenza crawled out from where he'd been concealed behind the white jade fountain. The High Priest had a blaster rifle in his hand, and his eyes held a mad glitter that told Han there was no way to talk his way out of this one. Hands raised, the priest directed. Han, Chewie and Bria all put their hands up. Han glanced at the others, trying frantically to think of a way to get out of this. But Teroenza had the drop on them but good. I shall enjoy this, Bria and Han Solo, Teroenza said. I have summoned a pilot, and he is coming to collect me from Colony 4. I shall be free of this wretched world, and I shall have my treasure. I shall miss my mate, but on the whole, not a bad bargain. Perhaps Desalogic can use my services. Hey, Han said. Jabba's a friend of mine. You kill me, he won't take it kindly. Teroenza laughed wheezily. Huts do not have friends, he said. Farewell, Solo. Pointing the blaster at Han, Teroenza's small, stubby finger began to tighten on the trigger. Han shut his eyes. He heard the sound of the blaster's whine. And he felt nothing. No pain. No searing heat. After a prolonged moment, Han heard the sound of a body fall with a loud thud. He shot Bria instead of me, he thought, and opened his eyes. But the body on the floor belonged to Teroenza. There was a huge, gaping hole where the priest's bulbous left eye had been. Han stared wildly, wondering if he'd gone mad and was imagining all this. What's going on? Beside him, Bria gasped. Han watched as Boba Fett stepped out of a dim corner of the room, his blaster rifle held in his arms. Oh, great, he thought. Now Fett will just kill us all. The bounty hunter kept them all covered as he walked to Teroenza's huge form, and then knelt on one knee. Keeping them covered with the blaster rifle with one hand, Fett used a vibro saw with the other. The little instrument whirred, slicing easily through flesh and bone as Fett carefully cut off Teroenza's horn. Han's head was whirling with shock. Finally the bounty hunter rose to his feet again, and then began backing slowly away, the grisly trophy tucked under his arm. Han couldn't help it. You're leaving? He blurted. Did Boba Fett's mechanical voice hold a slight undercurrent of amusement? Han couldn't decide if he was imagining it. That's right, the bounty hunter said. The priest is a priority bounty. I'm not here for you. And, having reached the opening in the wall, Boba Fett backed through it and vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared. Han's mouth dropped open, and he felt lightheaded with relief. Bria! He yelled and grabbed her again. The three shouted and celebrated for a long moment in the deserted treasure room. Han headed off to the Falcon to get the repulsor dolly. When he returned, they spent several minutes organizing the boxes for efficient loading. Suddenly a rebel assault shuttle settled down on the permacrete beside the Falcon. Han stared at it in surprise as Jace Pale and a squad of rebels disembarked. Bria, he said. Hey, what's going on? This is our treasure. We're taking it, and we're going away in the Falcon, right? Together, right? He looked at her, and she stared back at him. She bit her lip and didn't answer. Han felt a cold knot settle into his stomach. Bria, honey, remember you promised? We'd be together, right? Always. He swallowed. Bria! Chewie roared with anger and frustration, and suddenly Bria's blaster was there, in her hand, covering them both. Han, she said quietly, we need to talk. Han stared at Bria's drawn blaster, poleaxed. Honey, what are you doing? I need it all, Han, she said. Not for me, but for the Resistance. She waved to the rebels and they came in, took Han's repulsor lift dolly, and began stacking boxes on it. Han stared in disbelief as the first load of treasure went out the door. Bria, he said hoarsely, you can't do this. This ain't happening. You're just trying to kid me, right? I'm sorry, Han, she said. I have to take it all. Everything my teams could salvage off this wretched world. All the processed spice, all the weapons, all the treasure. I know it's not fair, but I can't help that. Did the other rebel commanders do this, Bria? Han asked. Not as far as I know, she said. But I was the one that got the communication last night, Han. Intelligence has discovered that the Empire has some kind of big project underway. Really big. So big that the fate of entire worlds could depend upon it. We have to find out what they're up to, and that will take credits. Lots of them. For bribes, surveillance, troops, you name it. I just hope what we've gotten here on Ilesia will be enough. Han wet his lips. I thought you loved me. You said you did? Another load went out the door. Han stared at it, wanting to moan aloud. Chewie did moan aloud. Bria sighed and shook her head. Yes, I love you, she said softly. I want us to always be together. Come with me, Han. You can't go back to Ner Shada now. Come with me and we'll fight the Empire together. You, me and Chewie. We'll make a great team. We all have to make sacrifices, and we'll have made ours in giving up the treasure. You don't think I'm keeping any of this for myself, do you? Han shook his head, and his voice was very bitter. No, I don't think that, Bria. Not for a moment. He took a deep, ragged breath. Bria, I loved you. Her face twisted in anguish at his use of the past tense. Han, I love you. I do. But I can't let how I feel about you jeopardize the Rebel Alliance. This raid was a test, and we passed it. The other resistance groups are going to see that we can get tilings done. Han, we took a whole planet. This raid is going to go down in rebellion history, I just know it. Yeah, as the raid where Bria then stuck it to people who trusted her. Including the guy she said she loved. Tears welled in her eyes, broke and ran. She stepped out of the way as her soldiers maneuvered yet another load of treasure out the door. Han, please, please, come with me. You're a born leader. You don't need to live like a criminal. In the Rebel Alliance you could be an officer, and they do pay us. Not much, but a little, enough to live on. Please, Han. He stared at her coldly. She was crying so hard now that Jace Pale stepped over and took the blaster out of her hand. We're loading the last bunch of boxes now, Commander. She nodded, then tried to pull herself back together, wiping her eyes on her sleeve. Please, Han. If you're too mad now, I understand. Just send me a message. Jabba knows how to reach me. Please, Han. I'll send you a message, Han said. Remember everything I said to you that night at the blue light? Well, it was all true, and I was a fool for ever trusting you. He dug in an inside pocket and took out a small pouch. Inside was a piece of flimsy. Recognize this, huh? She looked at it, came closer, and then backed away, nodding, her face very pale and set. Yes. Well, I'm such a fool that I carried it around with me all these years. Han snarled. But as of today, I am no woman's fool, sister. No woman is ever getting to me again. Ever. With slow, deliberate movements, he ripped the flimsy into tiny pieces, then let them slip through his fingers and scatter to the floor. You'd better get in your ship and get out of here while the getting is good, Bria. If I ever see you again in this life, I'll shoot you on sight. She stared at him in shock until Jace Pale took her arm and said, Commander, we've finished loading. I understand, she said in a small, shaking voice. Han, I am sorry. I will always love you. Always. There has never been anyone but you, and there never will be. I'm sorry. Pale encircled her shoulders with his arm and said to Han, I left you one box in your dolly, Solo. I'd advise you not to waste time here. The charges are set to go off in 30 minutes. Slowly, Pale backed out the door, keeping his blaster trained on Han and Chewie. The rebels beside the shuttle kept the Corellian and the Wookiee covered. Han stood there in silence as the rebel shuttle took off. When it was gone, he drew a deep, ragged breath, and it hurt. Another, and it hurt too. His eyes stung, but he bit his lip until the pain allowed him to gain control. Chewie, he said, this has been a great day, you know that? Chewie made a sympathetic, mournful sound. Well, we have to get moving, Han said. Tell you what, keep an eye on the time, and trot through the compound. Maybe they dropped some vials of glitterstim or something. I'll scour Teroenz's living quarters. I think he had some valuables in there. Meet me back here in 17 minutes, pal. HRRRNNNNGGGGGGGH. The Wookiee took off. Han scoured the treasure room and Teroenz's apartment, finding a few odds and ends and a sobbing Ganner TOS. Han looked at the old humanoid coldly. You are lucky you never married her, he said. Get out of here, TOS. This building is gonna blow in 15 minutes. The ancient Zizhan scuttled out the door like a bug. Han snorted in disgust and ransacked the apartment. When he carried a sack of minor collectibles out to the Falcon, Han looked around for Chewie. Hurry up, furball, he thought. He went inside the ship to warm her up, and then heard Chewie's roar, demanding that Han come out and see what he'd found. Han's heart leaped. A box of glitterstim vials. He raced out of the ship, only to stop short in confusion. Chewbacca stood there with a group of big-eyed, ragged children, hollow-cheeked and scared. He held the littlest tyke in his arms. The other 8 looked to be between the ages of 4 and 12. Han stared. What? Where in blazes did they come from? Chewbacca explained that he'd been scavenging amid the deserted buildings, when he'd heard sobbing down in a cellar at the back of the dorms. These children had apparently been born to some of the pilgrims, and forgotten by their exaltation-addicted parents in the aftermath of the raid. All the children were human, and Han guessed they were Corellian. He groaned aloud. Chewie! You were supposed to find something valuable. Chewbacca indignantly pointed out that children were valuable. Only if we sell the little darlings as slaves, Han snarled. Chewie's upper lip drew back, and he snarled, too. Han raised his hands. Okay, I was just kidding. You know I'd never deal in slaves. But what are we gonna do with them? Chewbacca pointed out that since the buildings were going to blow up in less than 5 minutes, now was not a good time to argue about the best course of action. Han scowled. Okay, kids. Get on board. Come on. I can rustle up some emergency rations, I suppose. 2 minutes later, the Falcon took off, and Han circled once around the colony. Below him, the buildings blossomed one by one into giant fireballs. After a few hours, there would be nothing left but charred, slagged remains to be reconquered by the jungle. Durga, Lord of Besatii, stared down at the Elysian nightside through the viewport of his yacht in disbelief. Infernos blossomed, clearly visible from space. The former sites of the colonies were marked by massive forest fires, whipped by the ever-present winds. There were survivors, Durga knew that. The Nova Force troopers who'd surrendered, old Ganner TOS. They'd contacted Durga aboard his yacht from a few portable comm units they'd salvaged. The moment the Hutt yacht achieved orbit, there they were, yammering to be rescued. But of the factories and warehouses, nothing was left except burning rubble. Gone. Durga couldn't believe it. Between one day and the next, in a matter of hours. Gone. All gone. Durga drew a deep breath and thought about the call he'd received only minutes ago from Prince Sizer. A pleasant, reassuring call, reminding Durga that he still owed Black Sun credits, but that in the wake of this disaster, Sizer would be happy to work out payment arrangements. The Black Sun leader had hinted that he'd be pleased to help Besatii rebuild the Ilesian enterprise. No, thought Durga. Not again. For one thing, the rebels had carried away thousands of pilgrims, and Zizor's intelligence indicated that they seemed to have found a cure for the exaltation addiction. With that many pilgrims telling the truth about Ilesia, it would be hard to gain new recruits. And the Tlandatil high priest whom Zir had recruited had taken one horrified look at the planet, and flatly refused to have anything to do with the whole scheme. No, Durga thought. I'll try something else next time. And there would be a next time, of course. He'd find another way to make Besatii richer than ever. And if he, Durga, had to serve Prince Sizer, well, then, he would rise to the top of Black Sun. His immediate goal was to become a Vigo. And after that, perhaps he'd challenge Sizer himself. Or even the Emperor. Durga knew he was clever, and he figured he was just as capable of ruling Imperial space as anyone. Durga glanced down at his one souvenir from this disastrous day. A long, blood-smeared horn. At least Uruk has been avenged, he thought. May he rest in peace. The Hutt Lord keyed his intercom, and his pilot responded immediately. Arrange for pickup of those mercenary troops, Durga instructed. And set course for Nal Hutta. I'm done here. Take us home. Yes, Your Excellency, the pilot responded. Durga settled back and sighed. Picking up Teroenz's horn, he stroked it thoughtfully, and began planning for the future. Han Solo and Chewbacca were still arguing about what to do with the Corellian orphans when they came out of hyperspace 6 hours later, and their comm system began to beep, signaling an incoming message. Chewie insisted that they must take the children back to Corellia, so they could be cared for by family. Han protested the waste of fuel and time. Dump them in a spaceport on any civilized world, and someone will take care of them, he argued. Chewbacca commented that as a father himself, he felt their only course was to take the children back to Corellia. Han glared at the Wookiee as he activated the comm to receive the incoming message. Jabba the Hutt's image materialized atop the control panel. Han, my boy! Hello, Jabba, Han said. What's happening? Jabba frowned slightly at the Corellian's lackluster greeting, then the Hutt Lord forgot his displeasure. Han, congratulations to you! The raid was a complete success. I am very pleased. Great, said Han grimly. Is that why you made an interstellar call? Oh no, Han, Jabba chuckled. I have a load of spice I want you to pick up from Morith Duel on Kessel. Bring it to me immediately on Tatooine, understand? The deal is arranged, the spice is paid for. Okay, Jabba, Han said. My usual cut? Certainly, Jabba boomed. And perhaps a nice bonus for quick delivery. I'm on my way, Jabba. Fine, Han my boy. Jabba peered at the Corellian thoughtfully. And Han, get some rest afterward. You look a bit haggard, if you don't mind my saying so. Right, Jabba, Han said. Will do. He broke the connection and scowled. Great. A load of whiny kids, and I gotta take 'em with me on a run. Maybe I oughta consider getting out of the smuggling business, Chewie. Chewbacca's only comment was that while they were on Kessel, they needed to pick up some Tralodon milk and flatbread for sandwiches. Han groaned aloud. 12 hours later, With the load of spice safely secured in the below-deck smuggling compartments, Han eased the Falcon up from Kessel. Leaving Chewie to pass out food to the children, Han headed toward the mall, checking his course. Suddenly a light flashed on his control board, and he realized that an Imperial customs ship was bearing down on him. "Chewie! Get up here!" he shouted, and began pouring on speed. Moments later, the Wookiee was in the cockpit. "Strap those blasted kids in!" Han shouted. "Then get up here! We've got 2 imps on our tail, and it's gonna be a rough ride." HRRNNNN. Han sent the Falcon hurtling along, faster even than the day he'd raced Sala. As Chewie slipped into the co-pilot's seat, Han heard a muffled squeak behind him, and glanced back to see a wide-eyed urchin staring at the Mew. "What are you doing up here?" Han snapped. "Great, just what I need. A sniveling kid." "Watching," the little boy said. "Aren't you scared?" Han grunted, flipping the Falcon up on her side to avoid a wash of ionized gas from one of the black hole clusters. The imp vessel shot at him, but it was a clean miss. "Great. Getting shot at with these kids here." "No, sir," the kid chirped. "This is neat. Can you go faster?" "Glad you like it," muttered Han. "Kid, I'm sure gonna try." He poured on the speed, skimming past the first of the black hole clusters. Their velocity made everything blur, almost as though they were going into hyperspace. Han had never gone so fast in the Falcon. "Huh!" he shouted, as they narrowly missed being pulled in by a black hole's gravity well. "Huh!" echoed the kid behind him. Han began laughing like a maniac as they hurtled along. "Like that, kid? Watch me outrun these Imperial slugs." "Go!" yelled the child. "Faster, Captain Solo!" "What's your name, kid?" Han asked as they came around the last curve of the Maw's terrible gravity wells, shearing so close that the engines strained in protest. "KRY Teska, sir." "And you like to go fast, eh?" "Yeah." "Okay." Han threaded his way into the pit, zipping along, and avoiding the hurtling asteroids by the seat of his pants. He realized that he was gaining on the imp. The customs ship was barely visible now. "If I can get just a little farther ahead." Sweat gathered on Han's forehead and ran down to sting his eyes, but he never eased up on his speed. The Imperial ship was far behind him now. Han ducked and dodged asteroids, and realized he was nearing the edge of the pit. "Great," he grunted. "All we gotta do is get out of here, and then make the jump to light speed." Chewie suddenly started whining and gesturing frantically at the board. Han looked at his instruments and groaned aloud. "Oh, blast! 3 imps out there on the perimeter of the pit. What else could they be doing but waiting for us? And one of them is a big sucker." Han's mind raced. "Chewie, we ain't gonna be able to outrun these imps," Han said. "And we're outgunned. But we've lost that guy on our tail, at least for the moment. I think if we can get far enough ahead, we should go ahead and dump the load just inside the pit, the way you did that time with Colonel Quirt on that other run. After they've searched the Falcon to their heart's content, we come back and retrieve the cargo. What I say?" Chewie was in full agreement. "Okay, take over. We gotta do this real fast," Han said. "Here's the coordinates. HRRNNNNNHH." Leaving the Wookiee to head for the coordinates he'd selected, Han raced back to the passageway with the secret compartments, with KRYSS in hot pursuit. "You kids, give me a hand here," he said, getting out coils of wire. Several of the children assembled and stood there, staring at him. "What are your names?" Han said. "Cat-he, sir," said a young girl of perhaps 12 or 13, with a long blonde braid of hair. "I'll help." "I'm Time," said a small boy. "I'm Aaron," said a dark-haired child. "I'll help." "Good," Han grunted, heaving up the deck plates. "Help me get these barrels carried into the starboard airlock, and we'll wire 'em together." Within 2 minutes, the spice was ready to be jettisoned. Han shooed the kids out of the airlock, then closed it firmly behind them. He ignored the standard depressurization procedures, and using the manual override, forced the outer doors to slide wide apart, blowing the spice barrels out into the void. "Chewie!" he yelled. "Jettisoned! Log these coordinates." With luck, Han should be able to track the spice's progress and find it again after a little searching. The barrels themselves were made of an alloy that would show up on his sensors if he got close enough. It was the best he could do, under the circumstances. Han ran back up to the cockpit, and raced back along his course, so he'd emerge from the pit approximately where they'd be expecting him to. As he headed out of the pit, the Imp Customs ship came hurtling up from behind him. Han looked at Chewie. That was close. Han's comm unit began signaling, and he activated it. "Unidentified ship, prepare to be boarded," an angry voice said just as Han felt the Falcon seized by a tractor beam. "This is the Imperial Light Cruiser Assessor. Offer no resistance, and you will not be harmed." Han sat there, with the kids clustering around him in the cockpit, watching as the Falcon was drawn toward the big Imperial ship. "Kids, let me do the talking," he said. Moments after docking, the Imperials were at the Falcon's airlock, demanding to be admitted. Han sighed and got up to let them in, with a trail of children tagging along behind him. The Imperial captain himself was part of the heavily armed boarding party. "Captain Tybert Capicat," the balding man with the supercilious air said, looking at Han as though he were a particularly unappetizing sight. "Captain Solo, you stand in suspicion of smuggling spice from Kessel. I am authorized to search your ship." Han waved at the interior. "Search away," he said. "I got nothing to hide." Capicat sniffed and managed to stare down his nose at Han, even though the Imperial officer was several centimeters shorter than the Corellian. The captain beckoned a scanning crew into the ship. "Search every millimeter," he ordered. "I want that spice." Han shrugged and stepped aside. The Imperials searched, and searched, and searched some more. Han and Chewie winced as they heard crashes from the lounge and the aft cargo compartment. "Hey!" Han protested. "I'm just an honest trader. I'm an Imperial citizen, you can't trash my ship like this." "Honest trader," Capicat sneered. "If you weren't running spice, then what were you doing?" Han thought fast. I was talking these kids back to Corellia," he said. "You see, there was this big rescue operation on a slave world, and these kids got left behind. So I brought 'em with me." The captain glared at Han. "Corellia is that way," he said icily, pointing aft. Han shrugged. "I had to stop off and buy food. Didn't I, kids?" "Yes," lisped little Time. "We was hungry. Captain Solo saved us." "Captain Solo risked his life for us," said Cat-he, twirling her long braid. "He's a hero." "He saved us," Aaron said. "We was gonna get blowed up." Little KRYSS came over and took Han's hand, stood looking up at the Imperial captain. "Captain Solo is the best pilot in the whole galaxy. He sure can outrun those Imperial SL, Han managed to put his hand over the boy's mouth just in time. Heh, he chuckled, grinning weakly. Kids. They say the craziest things. You a family man, Captain? Capicat was not amused. Finally the scanning crew returned, not looking pleased. Sir, we found nothing. We made a thorough search, Captain. Tibert Capicat's face reddened. He stood there, searching for words, then met Han's gaze. Very well, he said. Our brave hero Captain Solo claims that he was taking these children to Corellia. Such a noble act deserves an Imperial escort. Set your course for Corellia, Captain. We will escort you there. Han opened his mouth, then closed it again. With an effort, he nodded. Sure. Let's go. It took him the best part of a day to reach his homeworld. Han raged at the delay in collecting his spice. He knew that if anything happened to it, that Jabba would not be lenient. Business was business, and Hutz did not know the meaning of mercy. When he reached Corellia, he found that the imps had broadcast his arrival ahead of them, and there was a media blitz waiting for them. Han and Chewie were congratulated, hailed as heroes, and only the fact that Han had already won the Corellian bloodstripe kept the grateful government of his homeworld from awarding him one. Han was in a panic to get back to the pit and his dropped load of spice. Finally, he was able to say goodbye to the children, who actually were pretty good kids. He was forced to concede and head back out, a free citizen. The Corellian made best possible speed back to the pit and to the coordinates where he dropped the load of raw glitterstim. He spent the next 4 hours combing the outer edge of the asteroid field, becoming more and more frantic. It's got to be here, he exclaimed to Chewie. But it wasn't. Han searched for another 2 hours, using the auxiliary sensor units in the lounge to augment the ones in the cockpit. Suddenly he was interrupted by a roar from Chewbacca in the cockpit. I'm coming! He yelled, racing forward. Chewie pointed to the sensors showing 2 blips converging on them rapidly. Han checked the ship IDs and then swore bitterly, smacking his forehead with his hand. Great! More imps? That's all I need. Why me? He dropped into the pilot's seat and reversed course, heading back into the pit. Chewbacca growled an inquiry, wanting to know why they were running when they had no spice on board anyway. Don't you get it? Han snarled as he increased speed until the asteroids zipped past them in a blur. They must have found the spice we dumped, and they know what we were searching for. You know Capicat didn't believe us. He's behind this. These slugs will arrest us on suspicion of smuggling and impound the Falcon. We'll never get her back. He made a hard turn to port to avoid an asteroid the size of an imp destroyer. Besides, he added, I don't want them trashing the ship again searching her. We just got done cleaning up the mess Capicat and his boys made. Together, Han and Chewie sent the Falcon streaking back through the pit, toward the mall. His pursuers were 2 Imperial terrorist ships, and they followed him with reckless determination. Han's hands moved over his controls like a man possessed as they skimmed and flipped their way through the treacherous asteroid field. Chewie was howling aloud with terror at the chances his partner was taking. Shut up, fuzzface! Han yelled. I gotta concentrate. Chewie's howls dropped to moans, possibly prayers. Han was too busy to listen. They were nearing the end of the pit, heading straight for the mall. Chewie, I'm gonna have to shave the belly armor right off the Falcon, and hope those imps won't want to mess with these black holes, Han said tightly. Those slugs are not giving up. Chewbacca henned in despair. I can't help it. They're not getting the Falcon. The 2 Imperial ships stuck to the smuggler vessel as though they were hooked by tractor beams. Han and Chewie worked frantically over the Falcon's control board, adjusting their course, speed, direction, shielding. In desperation, Han sent the Falcon closer to the black hole clusters than any sane person would ever go. Only the ship's breakneck speed might save them. The Millennium Falcon skimmed so close to the black holes in the maw that only her terrible velocity kept her from being captured and sucked in. The watching eyes of the accretion disk seemed to widen and narrow as the Falcon soared and swooped in and around the treacherous gravity wells. The Imperial ships hurtled after him at top velocity. Han did an impossible spin, flip and swoop as he came around toward the last of them all. Studying his instruments, Han saw that one of the pursuing Imperial ships, the smaller of the two, hadn't been able to duplicate his maneuver. The ship vanished into the embrace of the black hole's accretion disk with a tiny, ignoble flare. "Yes," he said fiercely. "You're not getting me. Not today, not ever." Now the last Imperial ship was falling behind, and the Falcon was nearly out of the maw. "Yes, Chewie! We did it! Han!" Han sent the Falcon hurtling past Kessel, and then, suddenly they were free of the gravity wells. Han hastily bent over the navicomputer, then a moment later, shouted, "Course laid in! Punch it, Chewie!" Moments later they were safe in hyperspace. Han slumped back in his seat. "That was too close," he muttered hoarsely. Chewie agreed. As he sagged in his seat, Han noticed something. "Hey, Chewie! Look!" He pointed at the instruments. "We set a record!" Chewie commented bitterly that their speed record had come at the expense of his nerves. Han's eyes narrowed. "Hey, this is weird," he said. "It says we actually shortened the distance we traveled, not just the time. Less than 12 parsecs. Chewie growled skeptically and rapped on the distance gauge with hairy knuckles, commenting that Han's wild piloting must have caused a short, and the gauge was off. Han argued, but when Chewbacca, short-tempered, snarled at him, he gave up. Okay, I'm too tired to argue," he said, throwing up his hands. "But I did do it in under 12 parsecs," he thought stubbornly. But now he had more pressing problems to consider than speed or distance records. What in the universe was he going to tell Jabba? Han faced the craggy, scarred hollow image of Bidlo Quirv, Jabba the Hutt's Corellian majordomo. Behind Quirv he could see the sand-colored walls of the Hutt Lord's desert palace on Tatooine. "Hey, Quirv," Han said. "Let me speak to the boss, please." The ugly Corellian thug had jet-black hair with a vivid white stripe running through it, and vivid green eyes. Quirv smiled, a small and nasty smile. "Hey, it's Solo," he said. "Jabba's been calling you." "Where you been, Solo?" "Here and there," Han said shortly. He didn't like being played with. "Ran into a bit of trouble with the imps." "Well, that's too bad," Quirv said. "Let me see if I can get Jabba to talk to you. Last time I knew, he was pretty ticked 'cause you're overdue with that cargo. He's got some plans for that spice." Han stared stonily into the calm. "Just patch me through, Quirv, and stuff the jokes." "Oh ho, who said I was joking, Solo?" The Corellian majordomo's scarred visage disappeared in a wash of static, and for a moment Han thought he'd cut the transmission. He reached out to break the connection himself, when the static was suddenly gone, replaced by Jabba's massive hollow image. "Jabba!" Han blurted, in mingled relief and trepidation. "Hey, listen. I got a little problem." Jabba did not look happy. He was smoking some brown substance that rolled around in the combination hookah and snackarium he'd inherited from the dead Giliac, and his huge pupils were dilated from the drug. Great, Han thought. I had to call when he was spiced. Hey Jabba, he said. It's me, Han. Jabba blinked several times and finally managed to focus. Han! Boomed the leader of Desiligic. Where have you been? I was expecting you here last week. Well, Jabba, that's what I called to tell you about, Han said. Listen, it's not my fault. Jabba blinked muzzily. Han, my boy, what are you saying? Where is my load of glitterstim? The Corellian swallowed. Yeah, about that load, Jabba. Well, you see, it was almost like they'd set a trap for me. The imps were waiting and The customs officials have my spice? Jabba roared, so loudly and suddenly that Han couldn't help flinching back. How could you, Solo? No! No, no, Jabba! Han cried. They didn't get it. Honest, they've got nothing on you, nothing. But, in order to keep the customs guys from finding it, I had to dump it. I marked it, but they wouldn't let me go right away. And when I went back for it, it was gone, Jabba. My spice is gone, Jabba said, staring blearily at Han, his voice ominously quiet. Yeah? But hey, Jabba, don't worry. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Me and Chewie will work it off, we'll pay you the value, don't worry. You know we're good for it. And honest, Jabba, I got a feeling I was set up, you know? How many people besides you and Morith Duel knew I was going on a run? Jabba ignored Han's question. His bulbous eyes blinked rapidly as he took several puffs on the hookah. Then, reaching out, he grabbed a wriggler from the liquid-filled globe and stuffed the squirming thing into his mouth. Han, my boy, you know I love you like a son, he said slowly, portentously. But business is business, and you've broken my primary rule. I can't make exceptions just because I am fond of you. That load cost me 12,400 credits. Deliver the spice or the credits to me within 10 days, or face the consequences. Han wet his lips. 10 days, but Jabba. The connection was abruptly broken. Han sagged back in his pilot's seat, wrung out. What am I gonna do? 6 days later, having tried and failed to scrape up the credits from some of the sentients who owed him money, Han went back to Nar Shaddaa. He hated to do it, but he was going to have to borrow the credits from friends. He discovered that someone involved in that nightmare run, some imp officer or trooper, had evidently talked about what had happened. His fellow smugglers regarded him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. All because he'd set a new record for the run, trepidation because the news was out. Jabba was displeased, most displeased, with his former favorite pilot. Shug was off-planet, and Han cursed when he discovered that the master tech was gone. He knew Shug was good for that much, though it would strain his resources. Han made the rounds, managed to pick up a couple of thousand credits by calling in some old favors. But news of what had happened to some of the captains on Ilesia had spread, and several people simply looked the other way when Han approached. Han finally went to Lando's place. He didn't want to, but he was out of options. He knocked on the door, and heard the gambler's sleepy voice from inside. Who is it? Lando, it's me, he called. Han. The Corellian heard steps, then suddenly Lando jerked the door open. Before Han could utter a single word, the gambler's fist lashed out in a vicious sucker punch, catching Han in the jaw and sending him flying back across the hallway. The Corellian slammed into the wall, then slid down, landing on his rear. Han grabbed his jaw, spots dancing before his eyes, struggling to speak. Lando loomed over him. You have got to have the most colossal nerve in the entire galaxy, coming here after what you pulled on Elysia," he yelled. "You're lucky I don't just shoot you, you lousy, lowlife, double-crosser." "Lando," Han managed to croak. "I swear I didn't know what she was planning." "I swear." "Right," Lando sneered. "Sure you didn't. Would I have come here like this if I wasn't innocent?" Han mumbled. His jaw wasn't working very well. He could feel it swelling. "Lando, she did it to me, too. I didn't get nothing from that trip." "Nothing." "I don't believe you," Lando said coldly. "But if I did, I'd say good. You two deserve each other." "Lando," Han said, "I lost a load of spice I was carrying for Jabba. I'm desperate, buddy. I need to borrow." "What?" Lando grabbed Han's jacket in both hands and yanked the pilot to his feet. He slammed the Corellian against the wall. The gambler's dark face was barely a hand's breadth from Han's. "You came here to ask me for a loan?" Han managed to nod. "I'm good for it, honest." "Get this through your head, Solo," Lando snarled. "We've been friends in the past, so I'm not going to do what you so richly deserve and blow your head off. But don't ever come near me again." Slamming Han against the wall one more time, Lando let the Corellian go. Han slid down the wall again, as Lando stormed back into his flat. The door banged shut, and Han heard the lock click. Slowly, painfully, Han got to his feet. His jaw was throbbing, and he tasted blood. "Well, that's that," he thought, staring at the closed door. "Now what? We're not going to get out of here, are we?" Commander Bria then ignored the barely audible question as she ducked down behind the pile of rubble and ejected the spent power pack from her blaster. Or tried to. The pack was jammed. Looking at her weapon, she saw that the constant firing from the past few minutes of battle had fused the power connectors together, making it impossible to remove the empty pack. She swore under her breath, and crawled over to the body next to her. Jace Pale's features were frozen into an expression of tight, concentrated anger. He died fighting, the way he would have wanted to go. Grabbing his weapon, she eased it out from beneath his body, but before she had it all the way out, she saw the barrel was fused. It was as useless as her own. Glancing over at the pitiful remains of Red Hand Squadron, Bria said, "Anyone who can, give me cover. I've got to scrounge me up something to shoot with." Joanne nodded and gave her a thumbs up. "Ready, Commander." "I don't see anything moving out there at the moment." "Okay," Bria said. Tossing the useless weapon aside, the rebel commander peered carefully over the rubble, then stealthily slid around to the side, out from behind her cover. She didn't bother getting to her feet, not sure that her wounded leg would support her. Instead, she scuttled forward on hands and knees, keeping low, through the ragged hole in the outside wall of the half-destroyed Imperial comm center where they were making their last stand. A few meters away, an Imperial trooper lay, a hole still smoldering in his breastplate. Quickly, Bria crawled over and stripped the dead man of his weapon and spare power packs, noting wryly that the trooper must have used all his grenades before he'd been shot. "Too bad. I could have made good use of a couple of grenades." Bria thought about taking the man's body armor, but it hadn't done him any good, had it? Here, outside the remains of the Imperial comm center on the restricted world of Tapawa, she could hear better. And breathe better, too. The stench of battle was replaced by a cool night breeze. Bria crouched behind a fallen block of permacrete, daring to pull off her helmet for a second, then wipe her grimy face. She sighed with pleasure, as the gentle breeze cooled her sweaty hair. The last time she'd felt a cool, pleasant breeze like that had been on Togoria. "Where are you, Han?" she wondered, as she often did. "What are you doing right now?" She wondered if Han would ever know what had become of her. Would he care if he did? Did he hate her now? She hoped not, but she would never know. Bria thought about that day on Ilesia, and wished things could have been different. Yet, if she'd had it to do over again, would she have done things any differently? She smiled sadly. Probably not. The credits she'd raised had come in handy, and had led directly to this assignment. Torbil and the other rebel leaders had sent intelligence units to infiltrate Raltier, and they'd discovered that the Empire was shipping vital plans for its new secret weapon to its records center on Topawa. Torbil had been straight with her when he discussed the mission, using terms like recovery iffy and expendable. Bria had known what she was getting into, but she'd volunteered Red Hand Squadron anyway. She knew they needed the best for this job, and she was confident her people could deliver. And they had. This was the biggest anti-Imperial offensive of the Resistance so far, a coordinated offensive assigned to transmit the plans for the latest Imperial secret weapon. Bria didn't know all the details, but her assignment had been to seize this Imperial comm center on Toprawa and hold it, while the comm text transmitted the stolen plans to a rebel courier ship, a Corellian corvette that would, accidentally, pass through this highly restricted star system. When Torbil told Bria that the Rebel Alliance needed volunteers to accompany the intelligence team to Toprawa, to hold off the imps while the comm text did their job, Bria hadn't hesitated before volunteering. "Red Hand will go, sir," she said. "We can handle it." She looked out across the plaza, seeing the carnage of war reflected dimly in the streetlights. Bodies, overturned ground cars, wrecked speeders, the place was a mess. Bria thought about Ilesia, reflecting that place had been an even bigger mess, and she was proud that she had some responsibility for that. Glancing up at the sky, she thought about retribution. They'd lost contact with her, and Bria feared the worst. Time to get back to work, she thought, and crawled back into the wrecked comm center. Hearing the deep thrum of heavy repulsor lift units behind her, Bria sheltered behind the wall and peered out. Looking up, she saw the faint glint of light from the armor of a massive rectangular object floating above the permacrete of the ruined plaza. The Imperial heavy armor, one of the floating fortress class units, settled down into a covered position behind the remains of the communications and sensor tower, obviously getting ready for yet another assault on Red Hand Squadron, or what was left of it. Bria scrambled backward, crawling quickly, to pass the word to her remaining troops. "Listen up, people," she said to the survivors, so few, who were sheltering behind the barricade. She began passing out the power packs, dividing them up equally. "They're coming again. We've got to look sharp, hold them off as long as possible." They didn't talk, just nodded, and prepared to go to work. Bria was proud of them. Professionals. Dedicated professionals. It won't be long now, she thought, finding a good spot for herself behind the barricade. "People," she said aloud, "has everyone got their lullaby?" Murmured assents. Bria checked her own. She'd stuck the tiny pill to the collar of her fatigues, so that all she had to do was turn her head and stick her tongue out to get it. You never knew if your arms would be working, after all. "Come on," she thought to the Imperials. "It's rude to keep us waiting." What the imps didn't know was that they were already too late. Red Hand had managed to hold the Imperial reaction force at the outer perimeter, while the rebel comm text transmitted the plans to the courier vessel. It had been close. The imps had chopped the comm/sensor tower in half just seconds after the transmission had ended, but Bria had seen the acknowledgement from Tantive 4 with her own eyes. Transmission complete. Bria had also seen, before the sensors were cut off, the image of an Imperial Star Destroyer closing in on the Rebel blockade runner. Had that courier gotten away? She'd never know. Bria wondered exactly what they'd been transmitting, but knew she'd never know that either. As it was, she and her people knew too much. That's why they couldn't risk being taken alive. Not that the Imperials seem inclined to take prisoners anyway today, she thought. As she bent down to check the bandage around her thigh, the trooper next to her voiced the same quiet question she'd refused to answer earlier. We're not going to get out of here, are we? Bria looked at him, pale under his battered helmet, his eyes wide and staring. Skcot was a good trooper, loyal to her, loyal to their cause. But he was so young. Still, he deserved a straight answer. No, we're not, Skcot, Bria replied. You know that. The imps have destroyed our ships. No retrieval. And even if we didn't have orders to hold this comm center for as long as possible, there's nowhere for us to go on this world. Even if we could get past the troopers, we've got no transport. She gave him a wry grin and gestured at her wounded leg. I'd look really silly trying to hop out of here, wouldn't I? He nodded, and his face twisted with anguish. She looked at him closely. Skcot, we can't be captured. You understand that, right? He nodded again, then took out his lullaby and stuck it to his collar, the way Bria had. Yeah, Commander. I understand. His voice was shaking, but his hands on his weapon were steady. He leaned closer to her, not wanting the others to hear. Commander, I don't want to die. His admission seemed to drain him, and he trembled. Help me with this bandage, would you, Skcot? She said, motioning for him to tighten the medpack tighter on her leg. The kid's hand steadied a bit as he pulled on the straps binding it to her wound. Tighter! She told him, and he leaned back, putting his weight into it. A jolt of pain got though to Bria, past the painkillers that let her move about despite her injury. There, that's got it. Young Burrid sagged down next to her. Bria put her arm around him, as she would a brother she loved, and leaned close to him. I don't want to die there, Skcot. But I sure as blazes don't want the Empire to win. I don't want good people massacred, or taken as slaves, or taxed until they can't feed their families or live a decent life. Or just murdered by some Imperial moth who woke up cranky that morning. Skcot smiled slightly at her turn of phrase. So it's okay that we're not going to get out of here, right, Skcot? It's okay that we're going to go down doing our jobs, because they... She jerked her chin at their dead comrades. Did theirs. We can't let them down, right? Right, Commander, Skcot said. Bria hugged him tight, with a small, sad smile, and he returned it. He'd stopped shaking. Just then, Joanne, keeping lookout, called, They're moving out there. Bria rolled aside, pushing Skcot toward his position. She looked quickly between two pieces of rubble, and without taking her eyes off the opening, issued orders. Joanne, you stay down at first and get your launcher ready. After the rest of us open up, try to duck out and nail that floating fortress. Got that? Yes, Commander. People, remember to change positions after shooting, or they'll zero in on you with the repeating blasters. Everyone ready? Murmured affirmatives answered her. Picking up her borrowed blaster carbine, Bria checked the charge. Sighting down the barrel, she thought, Goodbye, Han. Something moved in the breached wall. Bria took a deep breath. Open fire! Tatooine is such a dump, Han thought, as he and Chewie made their way along the night-dark back streets. Jayless Nebel was so right. The two smugglers had arrived just hours ago. Han had decided that the only way to approach Jabba for more time to pay off the dumped load of spice was to talk to him in person. But things weren't looking too promising. So far he'd been unable to reach Jabba on the comm to request an audience. And back in Docking Bay 94 where the Falcon was berthed, he'd encountered that dumb Radian, Greedo, nosing around. The fool had tried to shake Han down for a payoff, implying that Jabba had taken a bounty out on the Corellian. As if echoing Han's thoughts, Chewbacca observed quietly that word was out on the streets that the Radian kid, Greedo, was hanging around in the company of a has-been bounty hunter, one Warhog Goa. Han snorted. Chewie, you know as well as I do that Jabba's just sending us a little message, hiring that dumb thug, Greedo. If Jabba really wanted me dead, he'd hire somebody competent to do the job. Greedo's so stupid he couldn't find his behind with both hands and laser torch. HRRNNNNN. Chewbacca also had a low opinion of the Radian. Han had a few spare credits, and he'd decided to check out the local games of chance. Maybe he could win enough credits to make a substantial down payment that would satisfy Jabba for the moment, then he could concentrate on scraping up the rest of the credits. They walked into the Crate Dragon Lounge and stood looking around. Over in the corner, sure enough, there was a sabacc game in progress. As Han and Chewie approached, the Corellian looked more closely at one of the players, a slender man with red hair and regular features. "Hey!" Han exclaimed. "Small universe! How are you, Dash?" Dash Rendar looked up, gave the Corellian a wary smile. "Hey, Solo!" "Hey, Chewbacca!" "Long time no see. What's this I hear about some caper on Ilesia?" Han groaned aloud. Dash Rendar gestured to empty seats, and Han and Chewie took them. "Deal me in, gentles," Han said, digging out a handful of credits. "Chewie, you wanna play?" The Wookiee shook his head, and wandered off to the bar in search of liquid refreshment. Han glanced at Rendar. "Hey, Dash, where'd you hear about the Ilesian raid?" After the way people had treated him on Nar Shaddaa, it felt good to run into someone he knew who was still speaking to him. "Oh, I ran into Zeen Affit and Kadium Buell last week, and they told me," Rendar said, dealing card chips. "They said their group of rebels treated them square, but the ones you had thrown in was stiffed everyone. That true?" Han nodded. "Yep. True. They stiffed me, too, but nobody will believe me." He scowled. "But I ain't lying when I say it. Jabba's on the verge of tacking out a real bounty on me, 'cause I can't pay him what I owe." Rendar shrugged. "Tough luck," he said. "Personally, I make it a policy never to get mixed up with those rebel groups." "Well, that's always been my policy too," Han said. "But this seemed like such a sweet deal." "Yeah, Kadia and Zeen were real happy, throwing credits around like they were band of fodder," Rendar said. They'd only been playing for a few minutes, and Han was losing, when he felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see a little Chowder fan standing there. "Huh!" She squeaked at him, and Han frowned. He wasn't too good with her language. "Cabe says there's someone outside wants to see you," Rendar translated. "Jabba. Jabba finally got my messages and wants to see me," Han thought. "He sent someone to bring me to him. Now I can talk to him, smooth things over." Han tossed in his card chips and stood up, motioning to Chewie to finish off his drink. "Okay, deal me out on this hand. I might be back later." With one hand on the grip of his blaster, Han and the Wookiee followed the street urchin out the back door, into the alley. They stood there for a second, looking around, but saw no one. Suddenly Chewie whirled. RRRHHHHH. It's a trap, Han realized at the same moment. The Corellian's hand dropped to his weapon, but before he could draw, he heard an all too familiar voice. Freeze, Solo. Drop the blaster. And tell the Wook that if he moves, you're both dead meat. I'd like another Wook scalp for my collection. Chewie! Han spoke sharply to the snarling Wookiee. Don't move! Slowly, Han drew his blaster, let it drop from his fingers into the dusty alley. Both of you turn around. Slowly. The Corellian and the Wookiee obeyed. Boba Fett stood there, in the dim recesses of the back street. Han knew that he was a dead man. Jabba must have decided to hire a real bounty hunter to make sure the job got done right. Han tensed, but Fett didn't fire. Instead, his artificially filtered voice reached the Corellian. Relax, Solo. I'm not here for a bounty. Han didn't relax, only watched in wonderment as Fett tossed Cabe a credit. The urchin scampered forward and caught it, then vanished into the dimness, chittering happily. You're not here for a bounty? Han said. Hila? Echoed Chewie, as amazed as his partner. Jabba told Greedo there was a bounty on you, Fett said. But he's just using that idiot to keep you on your toes. A reminder that he's serious about you paying up. If Jabba really wanted you dead, you know who he'd hire. Yeah, Han said. You got a point. He hesitated. So, why are you here? I landed an hour ago, Fett said. I made someone a promise, and I always keep my word. Han frowned. What are you talking about, Fett? She's dead, Boba Fett said. I promised her a while back that if she died, I'd tell her father, so he wouldn't spend his life wondering what had happened to her. But she never got around to telling me his name. So I decided to tell you, so you can send her a message. Dead? Han whispered through stiff lips. Bria? Yes. Han felt as though he'd been gut-punched. Chewie made a soft sound of sympathy, and put a hairy hand on his friend's shoulder. Han stood there for a long moment, trying to deal with all the conflicting emotions. Grief was uppermost in his mind. Grief and regret. Dead? He repeated dully. How did you find out? Bria then died 36 hours ago. The Imperials have a confirmed ID on her body. Her squadron was playing rear guard during some intelligence operation. Han swallowed. Don't tell me she died for nothing. Did they attain their objective? I don't know, the mechanical voice said. Someone has to tell her father, Solo. I gave her my word, and I always keep my word. Han nodded dully. I'll do it, he said. Render knows me. This is gonna hit him hard. He swallowed, and it hurt his chest. Chewie whined softly. Good, Fett said, and the bounty hunter took a step back into the shadows. A moment later, Han and Chewie were alone. Slowly, the Corellian reached down and retrieved his blaster. Memories of Bria assailed him. Did you think of me, honey? He wondered. I hope it was quick and painless. Han's steps came slowly as he and Chewbacca turned and walked to the mouth of the alley, and then turned onto the street. He had to find someone who'd let him use a comm unit. He had a very important message to send. The next day, Han made his way through the baking streets of Mos Eisley spaceport, wishing he'd worn a short-sleeved shirt instead of his grimy white one with his battered old black pilot's vest. Within 10 minutes of being out on the street, he had 3 different sentients come up to him, each with a warning that Greedo was out looking for him. Han nodded, thanked each of the informants, flipped each of them a desicard. It never hurt to have good contacts. The midday glare was painful to human eyes, and Han squinted as he walked. There are a lot of imp stormtroopers out, he thought, watching several squads trot by. Wonder why? The sight of the blaster rifles they carry made him think of Fett and last night. After leaving the bounty hunter, Han had found a bar owner who'd allowed the Corellian to use his comm unit, in return for a couple of credits. The Corellian had carefully recorded a message to Rendern. It had been hard to know what to say. In the end, he'd settled for, "Sir, this is Han Solo. I know you remember me. I have some bad news for you, sir. Bria is dead. She died bravely, though. You can be proud of her. She didn't want you to always wonder, so she asked someone to give you the message. Sir, I'm sorry. I know she loved you." Han Solo out. Han took a deep breath and said his own, silent, farewell to Bria therein. Rest in peace, Bria, he thought. Goodbye, babe. He reminded himself that Bria was part of the past. There was no use dwelling on painful memories. I have to concentrate on the present. Today he needed to see Jabba, that was for sure. And he had to find some work. Any work. He knew that Chewie was probably over at Kalman's cantina. Kalman was some kind of distant relative of Chewie's, along with half of Kashyyyk. Han headed over to Kalman's. Even at this midday hour, Kalman's was bound to be jumping. Han could hear the jizz band tootling away as he approached the entrance. Inside, it was dim and comparatively cool. Han took a deep breath, scenting intoxicants from a dozen worlds. He walked down the steps, nodding at Wuther, the sour, ugly bartender. Wuther jerked his head to his right, and Han reflexively looked over that way. Chewbacca was heading purposefully toward him. The Wookiee was plainly excited and pleased about something. He stopped Han by the entrance and conferred with his partner in low-voiced grunts and moans. Han tilted his head sideways and peered past the Wookiee at 2 humans who were standing at the bar. "A charter?" he said. "Well, hey, that's better than nothing." "Good work, Chewie." "Is that them? That old guy in the Jawa robe, and that kid in the moisture farmer's outfit?" Chewie nodded, commenting that even though the old man looked harmless, he dealt effectively with Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba just moments before, and used a most unusual weapon to do it. Han frowned, impressed. "Pulled a lightsaber, you say?" "Huh. I didn't know anyone still had them." "Okay, I'll work out the details with the old guy and the kid. You take him over to that empty booth and I'll join you in a second." Han paused for a moment to check out Kalman's as Chewbacca ushered their prospective customers over to the corner table. Good. No sign of Greedo. Then he started across the crowded cantina, where Chewie, the old man, and the boy sat waiting. The beginning. End of Star Wars. Rebel Dawn. Han Solo Trilogy Book 3. By A.C. Crispin.